Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin here with a huge week of World War III analysis. We are coming hot off of Trump's announcement that he is sending 2 nuclear submarines towards Russia. A very ambiguous statement. We're going to be analyzing all of that. This was supposedly in response to Medvedev's statements, which Medvedev's made many statements over the years. Not sure why this one explicitly escalated this. Obviously, we're going to be discussing why Trump has clearly been escalating against Russia for the past few months. We're going to be discussing the escalating situation in Gaza as the U.S. is supposedly handing Hamas a final deal where if they don't take it, they will be giving Israel the green light to go full scorched earth, completely destroy, ethnically cleanse. I mean, at a certain level, that might mean just lining up a bunch of people with machine guns and walking and killing every single person. So we're going to be discussing the future of that. We're going to be discussing Syria. We have clashes between the SDF and the SNA in the northeast, clashes between the Druze and the supposedly Bedouin tribes in the south. So we're going to be breaking that all down while Israel, of course, strikes Lebanon, advances in the West Bank as full annexation looms. Iran, of course, is sort of teetering on whether or not they want to negotiate with the United States, and Abbas Araghchi recently announced that the war could reignite with Israel at any moment. So we're going to be breaking down the situation with Iran as well. The situation in China and Taiwan has escalated. We're hearing reports from the deputy foreign minister of Taiwan that a Chinese invasion is imminent. So we're going to be discussing the contingency plans there. Obviously, September is now when France, the UK, Canada, Portugal, Slovenia, Malta, many countries now plan on recognizing a Palestinian state. This has triggered a big response, even supposedly an increase in the sanctions and the tariffs against Canada and other countries by the United States. Trump was not happy about this future Palestinian recognition. So big countries, big Israeli allies are about to be recognizing Palestine, and Israel was not happy. We're going to be discussing the arrest warrant against Milorad Dodik. We're going to be discussing some church news regarding the situation in the Sinai Peninsula. Some monks there attempting to overthrow the abbot of St. Catherine's Monastery. We're going to get into the Ghislaine Maxwell situation with Donald Trump, as well as some big situations in Turkey with Turkey, Greece, and everything going on in the region regarding the prophecies. So thank you all so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe, worldwarnow.co, get behind the paywall. Recent episode with Jose Nino about South America. Check that out, as well as previous episode with David Patrick Harry about Khazaria. 2 massive episodes that you get access to behind that paywall. But putting all of that aside, Dmitry, how are you doing? Big week of World War III analysis here on episode 129.
Absolutely. Doing great, Conrad. There's been a lot of rhetoric happening this week, a lot of nuclear talk, a lot of World War III talk, which of course I think the show speaks to. We do comment on these things, even though these are very hawkish political, rhetorical points being made by both Donald J. Trump and the former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, who frankly isn't our favorite Russian politician. However, his comment I think was very adequate. So the discussion between Trump and Medvedev took place after Trump, meeting of Keir Starmer, made the following comment. Do you recall a 50-day deadline that Trump set for Russia, which was supposed to end sometime in mid to late August? Well, that deadline was reduced to 10 days. And so suddenly there was an official or an unofficial reaction from Russia via a tweet of President Medvedev, a former President Medvedev, wherein he says, Trump's playing the ultimatum game with Russia, 50 days or 10. He should remember 2 things. Russia isn't Israel or even Iran. Each new ultimatum is a threat and a step towards war, not between Russia and Ukraine, but with his own country. Don't go down the Sleepy Joe road. So comparing Trump to Sleepy Joe Biden was of course incredibly offensive, and Trump responds very almost violently, essentially says that 2 nuclear submarines are going to be repositioned in response to Dmitry Medvedev's threat. And Medvedev again responds in kind, states that there is a dead hand option. So the dead hand option, of course, brings us back to the Cold War. Essentially, it is a protocol which hypothetically or even theoretically is set by major nuclear countries that will allow the nuclear decision makers, those positioned in nuclear launch sites across respective nations like the US or Russia or the Soviet Union during the Cold War, to fire off missiles at set targets, even if the leadership of that nation has been completely annihilated and destroyed. So if, for example, Trump launches nuclear missiles at Moscow and the entire executive branch of the Russian Federation has been essentially liquidated, the Russian nuclear missile sites will still fire. And that's the threat that Medvedev actually made to Trump. And the nuclear submarines, Trump forced them to move to reposition into certain locations. However, he didn't make it very clear, Trump that is, if the submarines were actually armed with nuclear warheads or were they actually nuclear powered submarines. I'm assuming these are the Ohio class nuclear submarines, which are both nuclear powered and they have nuclear warheads on board. Again, those submarines have been patrolling the seas anyhow, so it hasn't really changed anything. And the entire US fleet is located either in the Eastern Mediterranean or around the Persian Gulf in those locations. So the US fleet at the moment is already in the most battle-ready position that it has been in decades. So this particular comment doesn't really surprise us. However, I think it's quite interesting to see that Russia is also in a similar way to Israel, making these massive threats like the Samson option, right, which the Israelis bring up every now and then. Medvedev bringing up the dead hand. This sort of blackmailing rhetoric, again, does nothing for the war on the front lines. However, it does speak to the fact that Trump is not really negatively affected by the fact that Russia and Ukraine are not coming to the peace table, because the US at the moment is really limiting its donations of funds to Ukraine compared to the Biden administration. So in some cases, there's no real understanding as to why Trump is in such a rush, why he decreased the 50-day deadline to 10, if not for the fact that Russians entering Dubokrovsk was actually a big geopolitical surprise for the Ukrainians and for the NATO leadership. And there were official complaints made to Trump that, look, how could you allow the Russians to take Pokrovsk? It's such a key city. And as we'll mention briefly in the meeting between Lukashenko and Putin at the Valam Monastery, even Lukashenko mentions after Pokrovsk falls, there's a direct line to Kramatorsk and the liberation of the entire Donetsk Oblast. So the Russian leadership, the Belarusian leadership, and I'm sure the Americans and NATO understand the fall of Pokrovsk will mean an inevitable surrendering of huge territories to Russia and to the Donetsk People's Republic, and an inevitable expansion of the Russian world westwards. And I think, generally speaking, Trump's been receiving these complaints from his NATO allies, from Zelensky, from probably Ukrainian spokespeople around his administration. And now, in this frustrating manner, he lashes out. He decreases the 50 days to 10. But he doesn't realize that, frankly, this only leads to him being seen as the weak negotiating party. I think President Putin, even with a smile on his face, was meeting with Lukashenko. He comments on the fact that, look, Trump shouldn't set high expectations, then he wouldn't be disappointed. So I think the Russians are laughing at Trump. Trump looks like a boisterous child having a tantrum, and I don't think anybody is taking him necessarily seriously, especially as Russia progresses successfully on the front lines. However, I think Trump's commentary is very interesting. As we said last week, very hypocritical, Conrad. Whenever Russia bombards Ukraine, some of the key Ukrainian cities, Kharkiv, for example, Lvov, Kiev, and there are inevitable losses of civilian lives, the civilian lives do not match up to the, of course, inquantifiable losses carried by the Palestinians of Gaza. And yet Trump does not make similar comments towards Bibi Netanyahu or the Israeli leadership. So we can see the two-faced approach. The entire world can see it because all this footage is available online. And so Trump's tantrumizing about Russia killing Ukrainian civilians really isn't hitting home with anybody. And so I think here's where we stand at the moment. Trump is, again, a little bit embarrassed, humiliated, and these two submarines floating somewhere in the North Pacific or in the North Atlantic or in the Arctic Ocean really aren't going to make any significant changes.
Yeah, Trump, of course, with his recent 10 or 12-day deadline, he wants the Ukraine war to end by August 8th. They've told this to the UN Security Council. We're going to talk more about the Security Council situation in a second regarding the Palestine issue. But the threat that Trump is, the stick as opposed to the carrot that he is waving around here is the tariff and sanctions threat against the people that have been supporting, Russia's shadow economy, buying all of their oil. This is from antiwar.com. Both Russia and Ukraine must negotiate a ceasefire and durable peace. It is time to make a deal. President Trump has made clear this must be done by August 8th. The United States is prepared to implement additional measures to secure peace, U.S. diplomat John Kelly told the UN Security Council, according to Reuters. The message to the UN came after President Trump said earlier this week that he was shortening his original deadline, though he wanted to deal within 10 or 12 days. The president initially said he wanted the war to end in 50 days, a deadline that would have fallen on September 2nd. Trump has previously threatened to hit Russia's trading partners with 100% tariffs, and a bill in the Senate that has 84 co-sponsors would add 500% tariffs on any country that knowingly engages in the exchange of Russian origin uranium and petroleum products. Either step would have a significant impact on the U.S. and global economy since China and India are major buyers of Russian oil. Trump said on Thursday that he would impose 25% tariffs on India and other unspecified penalties, a step he has said would be taken in response to India's own trade barriers and its trade relationship with Russia, though he signaled that tariffs could change as Washington and New Delhi engage in negotiations. For its part, Russia has made clear that it's not fazed by Trump's ultimatum and that it's willing to continue the war until it achieves its goals. Russia and Ukraine are also extremely far apart on their conditions for a peace deal and making Trump's deadline for an agreement unrealistic. And China very quickly replied to this, saying that they were not going to stop buying Russian oil. However, in attempts to avoid the tariffs and sanctions, they have started exchanging Russian oil from ship to ship out in international waters. Curious as to how that's going to be remedied, or how that, I'm assuming they can just tell which ship is which, so I'm not sure how long that's going to work for. India initially indicated that they might be caving on this, but then replied that they are also going to be continuing their purchasing of Russian oil. So we're going to see how this tariff goes. We're going to see if this impacts any, maybe this pushes India and China closer to Russia in the war effort, if this cleaves one away but not the other. I think this is Trump's biggest economic escalation against Russia since he's taken office. So this, combined with the weapons to Ukraine, as well as the submarines, the big, rhetorical exchanges between Medvedev and Putin, it's clear that, we are right back where we were with Biden, just with Trump in the driver's seat this time. And this all comes as Russia advances into Pokrovsk. They're deeper into the city every day. They've liberated all of Chasiv Yar at this point, which was a 2+ year battle at this point. They are 10 kilometers outside of Zaporozhye. So things are very much going in Russia's direction on the front line. You mentioned the Lukashenko visit, where they seemed very casual about the whole situation. I don't know if that was the goal, if that was sort of the propaganda that was going on there at Valam, but it definitely worked. And Trump, I think, seems a lot more flustered than the Russians at this point. Zelensky and the Ukrainians are obviously taking heavy losses, but Trump, I don't know if he believes his own nonsense that he's getting from his advisors. He believes it is a 14-1 in Ukraine's favor on losses. He thought that it was like 112,000 Russians have died since the beginning of 2025 and 8,000 Ukrainians have died. That's not how these things work. I don't think he understands what's going on there, or he's of course just, spouting propaganda to hint to the Russians that he's not believing their press either. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the front line as it advances, Dmitry. Of course, I thought the Putin-Lukashenko Valam collab meetup was cozy, but I think the biggest news in the midst of all of this, World War III is going. It's going in all directions. We talk about Indochina. We talk about Iran, Israel, Gaza, Syria, but day by day, hundreds of square kilometers are taken by the Russians, and the Ukrainians continue to lose, which it's been years at this point, so it kind of falls by the wayside, but that is still, in a lot of ways, the epicenter of World War III.
No, absolutely. I think the Valam meetup between Lukashenko and Putin, and they gave a 30-minute interview to a variety of Russian actual journalists and media companies. So obviously the questions were very, shall we say, polite. The meeting was incredibly casual. Obviously, there's no ties or anything of that sort. I think Putin was even wearing jeans. It was very cozy. Of course, there was a cute little white dog sitting that Lukashenko picked up, put on the seat next to him, and it was loudly breathing, and all the microphones were catching the little dog huffing and puffing. I was like, what is that noise? And I see the little dog huffing and puffing on the seat, the bench. Quite cute. But obviously, Valam, the Holy Island, at the Smolensk skate, actually, they had the full Valam choir present them with beautiful prayers. And afterwards, in the half an hour discussion, a lot was said. Obviously, I just mentioned Lukashenko personally stated that Kramatorsk was next for the Russians. Lukashenko made interesting comments in reply to Putin when Putin said that, look, we've just taken Chasiv Yar, and Lukashenko very interestingly corrected Putin. He said, well, look, there's still Ukrainians fighting in certain buildings in Chasiv Yar, the Russians are still clearing them out. So, which kind of aligns with the reality on the ground, is that, yes, there are still some Ukrainian cells, or at least Ukrainian defense points in Chasiv Yar, which the Russians haven't exactly taken. And that's interesting because if you recall, about a year ago, literally 12 months ago, there was these big posts online, Chasiv Yar has fallen, the Russians have planted a flag on a certain apartment building. And that news came forth, and I think we even reported on the fact that there were reports on the front lines that around the time Toretsk fell, so did Chasiv Yar. And that turned out to be wrong. So the Ukrainians really have fought for Chasiv Yar this entire time. Yes, they did hold minimal positions there. Chasiv Yar is, of course, key because it leads directly with Pokrovsk towards Kramatorsk, towards Slavyansk, Izium, these cities which we've been talking about for a long time, which if you've been following the Russo-Ukrainian drama since 2013 and 14, these are very key locations which absolutely need to be liberated before you think of larger targets like Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, or even Kharkov. And it's very interesting to see that the casual approach of Putin in particular, he stated that none of our soldiers on the front lines have died in vain, which is, I think a lot of Z Patriot bloggers in Russia actually responded quite negatively to that comment because they said, well, There absolutely have been losses more or less in vain. There have been meat grinder assaults by the Russian forces, which were quite negative, like similar to the Great Patriotic War. There have been stupid sacrifices. There have been stupid assaults, which can't really be. Well, the best example is Ernest and Gudvin, they were the best drone and electronic experts in the Russian army. They were sent into essentially a meat grinder assault. These are two guys who built drones by hand. They repaired communications lines. They created, with just the resources available on the front lines, these electronic trolleys that would carry the bodies of deceased Russians and injured Russians through 10 kilometers of trench lines. Like incredible. Like these guys were just geniuses. They were sent earlier this year into a meat storm somewhere in Donetsk, basically, on a suicidal charge, and they were killed, both of these men. This, by the way, is still being investigated. So whether or not Putin knows about these events that took place earlier this year, we're not sure, but he was very casual about the entire thing. It was almost as if the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, the SMO, was spoken about as if it is some sort of business deal or some sort of diplomatic roundtable, not a war which has taken at least 50 to 100,000 Russian lives and easily 200,000 plus Ukrainian lives. I mean, this is larger than the Crimean War, bigger than the Russo-Japanese War in scale, and yet it's being handled so casually. Not sure if that's the correct approach, especially with Foreign Minister Lavrov, Conrad, who recently stated very openly, in contradiction to Putin's attitude, he stated that Russia is fighting a war against all of NATO, all of Europe, and he called it a war. Says very clearly this week, Lavrov called the special military operation a war, and he said that Russia has no allies. It's standing alone. He said, unlike World War I and World War II, in which Russia did have allies, in this war we have none. And that's, again, incorrect, because Russia, at the very least, has North Korea, and it had Syria. Assad was actually helping Russia until Assad fell. So at the very least, Russia had two allies in this war. And if Russia is fighting against NATO, then where are the cross-front deployments? What's happening to Finland? What's happening to the Baltics? Obviously, nothing is happening there. It's clearly a very different type of conflict. There's POW exchanges. It's very, shall we say, non-linear, as they say, non-linear combat, non-symmetrical warfare. This is exactly what's taking place on the ground. And I think theologically speaking, it is a civil war. I would agree with Metropolitan Onufri of Kiev on this particular question. The other very important point is that throughout the entire week, Russia has been very heavily bombarding Kiev. Clearly, there's a lot of cries for help from the Ukrainians to America, of course, trying to force Trump's hand. There's no new updates about where the Patriot missile systems are, whether or not they've been delivered by ship to Gdansk in Poland to the port, which will then take them by train railway lines all the way to Ukraine. There's no real indications about any American physical military aid arriving in Ukraine. We know on the front lines it's really heavy losses for the Ukrainians. Again, most likely I think the number of skirmishes per day, encounters between Russians and Ukrainians, has increased to 250 to 300, which is a huge number of just military encounters across the entire, several thousand kilometer front line. It's very intense. The battles are very heated. Sumskoye Oblast is again being solidified by Russia. All those losses that Russia has carried, they've lost a few villages a few weeks ago. However, they've regained them. The Ukrainians are being pushed back quite violently. And near Liman, near Kupiansk, the Russians again are pushing the Ukrainians. So it's really, at this point, Russia is winning the leverage game. In any future negotiations, which Lavrov himself stated that Russia is, with the request of the United States, we don't know if this was Marco Rubio or Steve Witkoff, who we'll mention when we speak about Hamas and Israel. There's some interesting new updates in relation to Steve Witkoff traveling to Moscow. Actually, as we record this episode, Russia's making great advancements. So if the Istanbul peace talks, as Lavrov has recently stated, do restart, Russia will have, I think, a stronger position. And again, we do see crazy stuff happening on the front lines, like crazy footage. There's Ukrainians are smashing drones, or at least trying to, I think a drone almost hit the nuclear power plant in Zaporozhye, which is insane. I don't know if they're trying to force a new Chernobyl type of situation. We saw absolutely crazy footage of a Russian, so a Russian used a shotgun to down a Ukrainian suicide drone, which didn't blow up. And then he picked up with his hands the drone, which was still on the ground operational, and he smashed it like a bat against a tree to break it, and it didn't explode. I mean, we're talking Terminator level. I don't know why you would ever smash a drone with that much that many explosives against the tree. Again, a very brave Russian, almost berserker level, but he survived. The drone didn't explode, and that footage was caught on tape. Very insane. So yeah, well and truly, the front lines are heavy, and there's been a new report, actually, quite negative news. We spoke about these occasional, Ernest and Gudvin early in 2025, the two drone commanders sent into a suicide assault. There's been a new Russian commander from the Donetsk People's Republic. He's a veteran of at least 10 years. He's been fighting since 2014, so same as Strelkov, same as Mozgovoy. His name is Sidoy. So Sidoy went missing recently. Now, people are not sure why. He was a very good colonel. He was supportive of Russians actually having very cautious assaults. He wasn't a big fan of sending his particular regiment into battle against the inevitable odds. He wasn't a fan of these suicide charges into the Ukrainian front lines. He unfortunately went missing this week. The Russians are still not sure where he is, at least the Russians on the internet. So again, it's these questionable disappearances similar to Kirill Stremolsov, some of these, especially base patriots from decades ago who invested their entire lives into defending the motherland and to defending the Orthodox Church and I guess the future of the Russian people. There's these strange disappearances, and so we'll be sort of on the lookout this week as to what exactly happened to Colonel Sidoy, where he ended up, if he's still alive. I mean, his wife said he's just missing in action. So I'm not sure how a colonel goes missing on the front lines, but in any case, it's very clear that Trump's agitation, Conrad, is well and truly due to the fact that the Russians are progressing. And Putin I don't think he's interested at all in sitting down at the table with Zelensky one-on-one. I think worst case scenario, he'll have somebody like Lavrov sit down with Marco Rubio, maybe Zelensky personally, or the foreign minister of Ukraine. That's the furthest that we'll go. I don't think Putin is in a position to have a one-on-one debate with Zelensky. Remember, Putin is not a debating character in and of himself, like a political figure. He prefers to send other people to speak for him. And so I think Zelensky's pushes for the Istanbul talks to escalate to some sort of Putin confrontation, to catch Putin stumbling on camera, is simply going to end in a failure. So I think we'll be watching as to how this sort of situation progresses. But there's, again, lots of sabotages happening on the front lines. Ukrainians are blowing up bridges in Bryansk. There's drone attacks on a daily basis. Russians are shooting down over 100 Ukrainian drones per day, flying over these SMO territories and territories which are adjacent to the Special Military Operations Zone. The civilians are, of course, living in fear, both Ukrainian and Russian. So the war has been incredibly destructive. And we are coming to the point where we're in this particular zone of, well, it's August, September. We're basically in a particular time where it would be very effective for either side to launch a counteroffensive because the ground is completely stable. You just need to pick a particular front and launch the assault. Remember, the Ukrainians, just around this time last year, they conducted their Kursk operation. So we are watching the news very carefully to try and spot exactly where either Ukraine or Russia launches its next assault. But from the Lukashenko-Putin discussion, Conrad, it wasn't very clear if that was even being planned because it did seem like an appropriate sort of discussion. Neither Lukashenko nor Putin showed any sort of urgency. It appeared that things were going according to plan. So Russians and Belarusians alike are being told to just trust the plan and just, remain patriotic until the end, and hopefully things will work out.
Well, in Putin's defense, outsourcing all of the outlandish claims to Medvedev and these other characters seems to have paid off because he can't really be caught on mic having promised anything short of what looks like is about to be accomplished, which is the territorial goals of the special military operation, meaning Kherson, Zaporozhye provinces, as well as the Donbass, including then in some capacity buffer zones near those areas and the demilitarization of Ukraine. If they keep up this steady pace and have a plan for how to handle Zaporozhye City and Kherson, then they could achieve that by 2025, maybe early 2026, that's all Putin ever promised. So I think he's kind of thinking about this in that very black and white political sense. But I think you're correct when it comes to the negotiations, Dmitry. I think Putin's dream is to have Lavrov sit down with Zelensky that gets the U.S. and the West in a situation where they're so desperate for negotiations that they force Zelensky to sit down with the foreign minister of Russia, not his, presidential counterpart, securing Putin's sort of role as this king, the deistic clockmaker behind the scenes, pulling the strings, but himself, having so much loyalty that he can send his loyal apparatchiks to handle even the highest of business. Even Putin's, highest lackey is still higher than, the president that he is fighting a war against. I think that's exactly what he would like to communicate if that's really how this goes. But as far as certain other people are concerned, Trump obviously wants to make sure negotiations go sooner than that. Erdogan, for example, has said that he foresees a Zelensky-Putin-Trump meeting with him in the future. Obviously, he thinks he has the clout to pull it off. But all these Istanbul negotiations, Ankara negotiations for other things, unfortunately, the Russians need to wake up to the fact that Erdogan is not a neutral negotiator here. And one of the biggest developments in the midst of the Istanbul negotiations is that a Ukrainian delegation, they visited the Turkish defense company Baykar and the Bayraktar drone factory, and they were personally met by the chairman of Baykar, Selçuk Bayraktar, who is, the genius behind the Bayraktar drones. He's, sort of the main Turkish military contractor right now that has turned Turkey into this sort of global arms supplier. They have a huge industry now. They've made billions at this point in the Russo-Ukrainian war, them versus the Iranian Iran drones. This is sort of the story of the war at this point. But not only did the Ukrainians, obviously with the approval of the Turks, meet with Bayraktar himself, but Bayraktar, for people that don't know, is married to Erdogan's daughter. Yeah, that's right. Erdogan's daughter married the drone father of Turkey, who have been the major drone suppliers for Ukraine for pretty much the entire war. So clearly Erdogan is aware of this, and he's been giving it the green light. So that on top of, his territorial claims supporting Ukraine in Crimea, the Russians really need to stop, thinking about Turkey as this neutral civilization state that tries to play NATO and Russia against each other. Yeah, he wants to seem like that because idiots like you in the Russian foreign ministry will believe it. Unfortunately, that is not the case. And we're going to be discussing a lot more about Turkey later on in the episode, especially their growing super alliance with Kazakhstan, the negotiations with other Central Asian Turkic states via Azerbaijan on behalf of the United States and Israel, attempting to bring them all into the Abraham Accords, of course, with no resistance from Turkey, who claims to be the best friend of the Palestinians. They're the ones standing up to Israel. It's all a bunch of fugazi nonsense. So we're going to be breaking all of that down later in the episode. But I had to ask a question I want to ask you, Dimitri. I almost forgot. Have one story to read here, and that is that Nicaragua has recognized Russian control over the occupied Ukrainian territories in a letter to Putin. They are the first country to sort of do this in a formal way. So obviously certain other countries are going to follow. Obviously North Korea, I'm sure, will do this in some capacity in the near future. Belarus, who, again, Belarus and Russia are very slowly but consistently becoming the same country, so no surprise there. But this is, very interesting. I know, Dimitri, we're going to talk a bit about Nicaragua and Tucker Carlson here, but before we discuss sort of that digression with the whole Putin, Tucker Carlson, CIA situation, I do have to ask you, Dimitri, what do you think the Russian plan is for Zaporozhye and then secondarily Kherson, I guess, because we know that there's no way that Putin could give those up in negotiations at this point, considering how long he's refused to come to the negotiating table. So we still haven't really seen the definitive Russian populated city sort of siege tactic. Of course, Mariupol mostly still fell in the sort of initial flash assault that occurred in the first few days, after, February 24th, when all of this began in 2022. A few other towns and cities obviously had experienced this. Kherson, of course, was able to fall very quickly, but then they were forced to retreat. So that was one of the biggest losses of the war. I'm curious your analysis as to how the Russians are going to handle these cities that they undoubtedly are going to need to secure sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I think at the moment, Conrad, from what we've seen, the most successful siege thus far there's been two. I would say Bakhmut absolutely was one of the big failures, but the two successes was probably Avdiivka and Mariupol. Mariupol, because the Russians surrounded it, obviously from the sea and the land at the same time. They effectively took the city. The city had elite Ukrainian soldiers within it, of course, Azov Battalion and many other thousands of Ukrainians. Many prisoners of war that the Russians did take, actually, of course, they took in Mariupol itself. Avdiivka, they allowed the Ukrainians to leave. So Avdiivka was a great strategy, which I think in Pokrovsk, there's, I think, one road remaining that they've, as I've said last week, they were free. Pokrovsk has one particular highway which the Ukrainians can still use to leave the city. I think they want an Avdiivka scenario here. They want the Ukrainians to leave rather than to spill brotherly blood in the city of Pokrovsk itself in this really heavy, violent urban warfare, which is about to ensue and probably taking place right now as we speak, as the Russians are pushing deeper into this quite large suburban area. So speaking of the violence, of course, I think the Russians, looking forward into the future, taking a large city such as Kharkov with major factories on the outskirts, it would only be possible by cutting it off from mainland Ukraine. Of course, not starving the population per se, like the Palestinians in Gaza, but at least forcing the Ukrainians to have an orderly either retreat or surrender out of the city, an armistice, maybe like a localized ceasefire to be announced once the Russians effectively surround the city of the size of Kharkov. But speaking of Zaporozhye, that's See, the problem with Zaporozhye is the fact that it's so close to Dnipropetrovsk, it's so close to central Ukraine, Kiev. We're reaching areas which the Ukrainians simply, I don't think, would even allow to fall. Kherson is a different subject. The issue with Kherson is the fact that it's on the other side of the Dnieper, so the right side of the Dnieper, the western side. It's not actually possible for the Russians to create this. I've seen a lot of theory crafting geopolitical analysts, Conrad, create a Russian buffer zone line across the Dnieper River, basically. Like, okay, so the Dnieper is a natural border between eastern and western Ukraine, which the west can be NATO controlled, and we can have UK, French, NATO, EU peacekeepers patrolling this buffer zone. However, Kherson goes directly against that. So I wonder if the Russians almost overzealously calculated the fact that they'll take the entirety of the Khersonskoye Oblast, with the city Kherson itself being on the western side of the Dnieper. That means the Russians will need to capture that bridgehead. They will need an amphibian-style operation to breach the Dnieper, to either go around the Black Sea and then, of course, take the rest of the Khersonskoye Oblast on the Ukrainian side of the Dnieper, which, again, at the moment seems to be quite an escalation. But if this particular Ukrainian-Russian war ends in the next 12 months or so, with the Russians taking Kherson, taking the four oblasts, this will be a huge victory. I think, yes, we've said the best case scenario is for Russia to liberate all of Ukraine. However, simply having Kherson City, having a bridgehead on the other side of the Dnieper, will leave a huge opportunity for future potential, shall we say, escalations if Russia ever chooses to either defend the Orthodox Church, defend the Russians living in Ukraine from genocide. They can always, again, push through the Kherson City, use it as a bridgehead, as an organizational base camp, and then, of course, expand further into Ukraine through Nikolaev, Cherkasy, Zaporozhye, and then push forward onto the rest of Ukraine, basically. So I think taking Kherson before any sort of long-term ceasefires will be the key to, I think, a prolonged success for the Russian Federation. And so I do somewhat agree with Putin. However, at the moment, look, there's been no real attempt by Russians to breach the Dnieper. So, I think quite surprisingly so. I think their main goal at the moment is the Donetsk Oblast. It's obviously to create some sort of buffer zone in the Sumsk Oblast, and of course expanding into Zaporozhye. What's interesting is we've spoken about Russians simply, entering into Dnipropetrovsk very slightly, Conrad. However, what's notable is this week, the Russians have been fighting along the Dnipropetrovsk border, but have not entered into it. Like, they very clearly understand that this is not Zaporozhye, it's not Donetsk. They know that this will essentially escalate the Russians' advance into a point that isn't essentially legally based in the constitution. It doesn't have any sort of international recognition. And I'm not saying that Nicaragua is, countries like Nicaragua and North Korea, of course, sort of giving Russia an excuse to expand into these four oblasts. Russia can do that itself simply by executive decision of President Putin. But we need to keep in mind the Russians are very aware of the four oblasts they need to take, and they're not taking more than that. It appears that Dnipropetrovsk is just not a goal for them at the moment, which I think is very strange, because on one hand, Lavrov is calling this a war, right? Almost a civilizational war. We have to remember Shoigu said it's a civilizational war against all of Satan. Kadyrov said this as well. He said the Western Satan, Russia's fighting against that. Abtiel Udinov, the general of Chechen heritage, said the same thing. Like he said, Russia is fighting against the Western satanic civilization, whatever in hyperbolic terms he called it that. So if this sort of rhetoric is being used, then there's no excuse for Russians not to enter Dnipropetrovsk and actually escalate the conflict further. But at the moment, Conrad, Russian siege warfare is very limited by the number of Ukrainian drones on the front lines. The fact that there are 2 million plus drones means the Ukrainians can halt any Russian advances. There has been reports, for example, in Kharkov. So the Russians are trying to take Volchansk, for example, and in order to take certain Ukrainian defensive positions, they need tanks. And the Russians are calling for tanks, at least the Russian battalions on the front lines, and the commanders just not sending them because they're afraid of losing this expensive heavy armor to Ukrainian mines, drones, and other technologies. So we can kind of see the Russians playing a very conservative game. And in fact, Lukashenko said exactly the same thing during his talk with Putin at Valam. He said, if you compare this war to the Second World War, the Russians are, he says we. So Lukashenko, notice he's speaking for Belarusians and Russians. He's saying we are suffering a lot less on the front line than during the Great Patriotic War, which speaks to the humanitarian aspect of the special military operation, which again, we've disputed, Conrad, before in the show, because really how humanitarian is it if there are these meat grinder assaults on cities? So I think it'll be interesting to see exactly how the Russians take Zaporozhye and Kherson. At the moment, I think Kherson is much more valuable because it creates this futuristic bridgehead which can be used, and it's almost like a guarantee. Having a city on the Ukrainian side of the Dnieper, it guarantees future cooperation by Ukrainians. And one more thing I wanted to mention just about the Russians moving forward. I think the reason why the Russians have started to really push westwards through Donetsk, taking Pokrovsk, essentially pushing through Chasiv Yar, is because they realize the threat of these Western countries to send in these international peacekeepers like in Kosovo. That would absolutely, of course, I think on one hand, it would create this obviously buffer zone which Russians would never be able to breach under current circumstances. This would invoke Article 5 of NATO. Of course, it would escalate the entire conflict into a nuclear war, but at the same time, it would also create a scenario of cultural genocide on the western side of the Dnieper under the protection, similarly in Kosovo, to the genocide of the Serbs, which took place under the protection of KFOR and those international peacekeepers. And in a similar way, I think in south of the Litani River, how we see the UN troops not doing anything about, Israelis killing civilians of Lebanese origin. So I think the Russians are very clear that they don't want any international interventions in Ukraine on the ground, and they're willing to push as quickly as possible towards those four territories, towards the Dnieper, in order for that not to become a realized reality. And in relation to Nicaragua, I think very important in this scenario, Conrad, just to mention the fact that, the Tucker Carlson expose produced by Nicholas J. Fuentes on his show, which can be caught on Rumble, it's a really good 3-hour, not a hit piece, I would say it's a defensive retaliation against Tucker Carlson, who had an interview with Candace Owens, the African-American married to, of course, a lord of the British Parliament. Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens discussed how bad of a figure Nicholas J. Fuentes was to the American conservative movement. They described how dangerous he was to young American white people, etc. And this, I think, was entirely inappropriate. But Fuentes retaliated very powerfully in a 3-hour expose, which I think most of our listeners should probably watch because it does present a case of Tucker Carlson not being necessarily the transparent truth sayer that he portrays himself as. I think it's very interesting. It exposes this particular former Fox News spokesperson, this talking head, as just another member, like maybe a few degrees removed member of the military-industrial complex of the US. He's not a neocon per se, but he is very much pro-American. He is tied into J.D. Vance and exactly what the American state is trying to push. And again, he's definitely not anti-Zionist. That is Tucker Carlson. But we know Tucker Carlson's history with Nicaragua, his father, of course, being heavily involved with the Nicaragua CIA operations. And Nicaragua is one of these interesting South American countries where just south of Mexico, you had this huge push by the USSR during the Cold War of fomenting communist regimes. Nicaragua was one of these countries in which the communists ended up winning. And this is probably why in Nicaragua in 2008, they actually were the first country, I believe, to recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia after the 5-day Russo-Georgian conflict, which was, under Medvedev's presidency, which is quite interesting. So notice Nicaragua, it survived all those coups those coup attempts and the civil war that was pushed by the CIA and pushed by these Green Berets of America in the 20th century, by Tucker Carlson's father, actually, as well, promoted by these sort of people. And now it's very strongly a pro-Russian, essentially South American communist quasi-socialist state. And I think that's the most interesting thing, is that Russia still holds on to that sort of communist, sort of Red Army heritage, because notice Russia's best allies, they're simply the Assad regime, or at least it was, the regime which received arms from the USSR, during the Arab-Israeli wars. It was North Korea, which is obviously a communist country. It's China. It's the greatest economic ally of Russia at the moment. And of course, Nicaragua. So all the sort of the post-Soviet heritage is very true and alive. And I think that's quite curious, almost amusing. But again, it speaks to the fact that the USSR very much had much stronger diplomatic leverage than the modern Russian Federation does, because we can't, I think, even say which countries Russia has improved its relations with. Clearly, and we'll speak about this in a moment when we discuss Central Asia and Azerbaijan, Conrad, but the only other countries Russia has really developed strong ties with are these new Central European, Eastern European countries such as Slovakia, Hungary, maybe even Republika Srpska in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Austria, etc. All these countries which rely heavily on Russian gas. These are probably the only nations Russia has improved relations with. All the other nations, it's only the inheritance which Russia relies on from the Soviet Union. So that's, and I think even Russia's nuclear arsenal, that's also an inheritance of the USSR. Nothing new is being created. It's just a simple reliance on the fatherly figure of the Bolshevik communist state. And that's quite unfortunate, I think, because these European countries really can't be relied upon. And I would even say Nicaragua is a much more shall we say, stable ally alongside North Korea than some of Russia's European neighbors.
I totally agree with your characterization of Fuentes' response, obviously completely defensive. I mean, Tucker and Candace getting up there, Tucker pretending not to know who he is, despite having referenced him on the show all the way back in 2021. Tucker bizarrely claiming not to know his own father was in the CIA, despite the fact that Putin pointed it out to him before his father even died. We have the clip of that as well. And of course, the reason the Nicaragua thing makes sense regarding Russia and why it connects Tucker Carlson is, of course, Nicaragua's sort of the ultimate non-aligned state in the Western Hemisphere. If, the USSR still existed, Nicaragua would be its number one ally. Nicaragua is an ally of China, Russia, North Korea, all of these places. They persecute the Catholic Church. They've been sanctioned by the US. They're by far sort of enemy number one in Central America right now, still the lingering, communist ally. And the Iran-Contra scandal has to do with, the Iranians funding the Nicaraguans and the U.S. funding the, capitalist rebels against Nicaragua and the freedom fighters, as they called them. And Tucker was down there arming them, and Iran was there fighting against it. And so it all comes together in that regard. And of course, Fuentes was completely right to point out how ridiculous it is to claim that CIA agent Joe Kent was somehow, taken out by the CIA, and that, again, Tucker claiming he doesn't know. His dad was in the CIA, claiming that, again, there's no evidence. Everyone claims, where does the money come from for Nick? No one has ever presented any hard evidence that Nick is paid by anyone besides the super chatters. Everyone tries to bring up the shadowy crypto thing, which was transparently explained from day one. I remember when it happened, when the guy who said he was going to kill himself gave Nick the big crypto donation. It was everywhere. It was easy to read about. Everyone, of course, calls Nick a homosexual, where there's also no evidence for it. It's just another piece of slander that he's at this point become remiss to even try to argue, because it's become one of those things where, you're arguing against it, so therefore it must not be true. But this isn't just a Nick Fuentes defense stream, but I think even a lot of people that were much more aligned with Tucker and Candace, and they don't like Nick's style, they don't like how he handles things, they maybe even disagree with some of his opinions, but even some of those people, I think, were forced to admit that, okay, Nick is clearly in the right here, and we could maybe do a whole stream and discuss our perspective on, I think there's even a unique Orthodox perspective on the whole Palantir, Trump sphere. Again, people need to remember, Dimitri and I, we were skeptical of Trump, talking about Trump as a type of Antichrist, Project Pogo, Project Zephyr, Zionism, Greater Israel, before Nick even disavowed Trump. So we were well ahead of the curve on all of this. So I hope that people realize that, yeah, I'm a fan of Nick, but in many ways, Nick, I think, has come around to what we were saying even longer than he has. And that's a testament to him. And it's part of why I'm more willing to defend him than I ever was before these days, because he is, I think, moving in the right direction. And some very holy people that I know actually also think Nick is a very effective communicator and is doing a lot of good work. So, that's the perspective there. But I think we have to move, obviously, in the subject matter at hand, with Nick and Tucker also lying in the background is Israel, the reason that Joe Kent disavowed Nick to begin with. And of course, in Greater Israel right now, there's been a sort of ultimatum handed to Hamas by the United States, supposedly a total disarmament of Gaza, Hamas completely ending. There's a plan to allow a sort of U.S.-governed transitional government that I think would then transition over to something akin to Egypt and Saudi Arabia, controlling it in conjunction with Israel. And I guess the U.S. has said that if Hamas doesn't agree to this pretty much imminently, they're going to give Israel the green light to go in and do whatever they want. And we're getting over 110 people still killed daily in Palestine. That's not even including people starving to death. Obviously, Dimitri, you mentioned Witkoff leaving Israel now to meet with the Russians. I think this was when the United States plan was delivered. And of course, all of this comes amidst all of these other countries. I believe the full list is the United Kingdom, France, Canada, Portugal, Malta, and Slovenia are all planning on recognizing Palestine in the very near future through their legislative branch, or at the September meeting of the United Nations General Assembly in New York City. And this, of course, led to a huge response from Israel. Germany said they would even potentially consider it, and even hinting at that, the Israeli foreign minister and the ambassador to Germany and the ambassador to the United Nations says Nazism has returned to Germany. They like the idea of Germany even hinting at doing it frightens them even more than these other countries actually doing it. But they went after France. They went after the UK. They're going after them so hard. And of course, Trump even said that Canada chose to recognize Palestine. This is making a trade deal completely impossible. What the hell does Canada recognizing Palestine have to do with US-Canada economic trade? Absolutely nothing. But of course, who controls the economy? Who are the merchants of the world? Of course, it's the Jews. And who controls Donald Trump? his Jewish puppet masters that he sold the West Bank to for $100 million. And now he's using the stick of the U.S. economic might against our northern European neighbor, Canada, that in their meek humanitarian way are doing what they can, even over the United States, to help the Palestinians. And that is, recognize this no Hamas, very pro-Israel Palestinian state, which the Jews still just can't stand. And what does Trump do? Boom, 35% tariff, extra 10% just because you want to play games and recognize Palestine. So ridiculous. I mean, we're in a Jewish fascistic state where the United States bureaucracy, economy, naval, army, merchant marine apparatus has been completely hijacked to serve the interests of Zionism and world Jewry. And we all just have to sit back and take a few crumbs, like the occasional deportation or, beef tallow in the fries at Steak and Shake. We take these crumbs that fall off the table as the Jews take over the world. And it's really starting to piss me off, and it's very, very disgusting, especially considering how much of our tax dollars are going to directly supporting the genocide in Gaza that is now expanding into the West Bank.
No, absolutely. And there's been an interesting scenario that's arisen as Russian political commentators have stated. What is Witkoff's next goal? Obviously, he's Trump's personal presidential aide. He's not linked to the State Department. He's not linked to the foreign ministry of the US. He obviously answers to one person, that's President Donald J. Trump, and obviously communicates with J.D. Vance as well if he needs to. However, Witkoff's traveling to meet with Netanyahu. We're not exactly sure what he spoke about with him behind closed doors, but most likely, and this is what Russian commentators are stating, is that Witkoff is traveling to Russia in order to propose to President Putin, and this is entirely speculative, keep this in mind. It may be completely debunked by next week or by the time you're listening to the episode, hopefully not. However, the proposal will be to President Putin so that Putin will come out as the middleman in the future Hamas/Israeli negotiations of peace. This is a very interesting proposal. We know Putin and Bibi Netanyahu, they're not best friends like Trump and Netanyahu, obviously, but they still know each other. Netanyahu has been at least one or two victory parades in Moscow for the 9th of May. Netanyahu can speak fluent Russian. Hamas has also been invited, as well as many other Palestinian resistance groups, to travel to Moscow several times in the last few years. They've met, I believe, even with representatives of the Orthodox Christian Church, the Russian church, that is. They've met with, not Putin personally, but they've met with people from President Putin's administration. So if Witkoff really is flying to Russia to make this proposal, I think on one hand, I think it's almost like they're going to try and shift the blame potentially on Putin, Conrad, if the negotiations go awry, on one hand, right? So obviously using Putin as a scapegoat. And Trump obviously is being a bit humiliated by the fact that he's not able to solicit peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis, right? So he wants somebody else to take the heat off. And Putin, clearly being the second most popular politician in the world after Trump, arguably maybe even more popular than him, will essentially take the limelight off of Trump for a little bit, maybe take the heat off of Trump and his recent geopolitical failures and international relations failures, especially after the Operation Midnight Hammer in Iran and the fallout from that. So it's very interesting if this particular proposal will come to pass. And I think it's quite dangerous for Putin as well to get involved in the Israeli-Hamas peace talks, because we get Hamas, obviously Muslim Brotherhood background. We're not sure what kind of ties they have to Qatar. They don't answer to Putin at all. These are Sunni Muslims who supported HTS. And we remember recently, again, this could be all related, but the foreign minister, former HTS, former Al-Qaeda affiliate, foreign minister of Syria, this new Al-Jilani al-Shara-led Syria, traveled to Moscow as well this week, met with Lavrov, and stated that he's looking forward to this new Syria-Russian cooperation going forward. So we're very much in this strange world where the Russians both recognize the Taliban, they recognize HTS, they recognize Hamas. They're willing to work with terroristic and quasi-terroristic organizations in order to pursue geopolitical goals. And Trump is trying to potentially even challenge Putin and stating, well, look, if you collaborate with Islamic extremists so well, how about you speak with Hamas on behalf of world Jewry? Maybe Beryl Lazar is probably behind Putin, whispering in his ear saying, yeah, take the deal, speak to Witkoff, speak to Netanyahu. And I think this is very incorrect, because Putin is not responsible for any of the genocide taking place in Palestine, Gaza. This is something the US has been funding. It's something that the US is responsible for. Yes, if Putin can be a peacekeeper, if he can bring the IDF to stand down, I doubt very much he can do that, because notice, he couldn't get the Israeli Air Force to stop bombing Syria, right, during the Assad regime. So what kind of leverage does Putin really have over the Israelis besides the fact that he can speak Russian to Netanyahu? I don't think there's any benefit of Russia getting involved in these peace talks. I think this is a great big red herring. Maybe it's even a distraction, a tactic to distract Russia from its regional interests in Kazakhstan, in Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Ukraine, Belarus, etc., and all the other goings on, which again there's a lot of things happening in Europe and in Central Asia. For Russia to get involved again in the Middle East on behalf of Trump, I think this is very inappropriate. So, this comes to pass, as you said, Conrad, with all these left-wing, left-leaning, almost quasi-socialistic nations, Canada, of course, Western European countries, France, all the countries except for Germany. Notice how loyal Germany is to Israel, Conrad. It's very interesting. Again, Germany has been literally placed on its knees. They're going to be loyal to Israel until the very end, as they're paying reparations for the alleged event that took place during World War II as well. All the other countries, including Keir Starmer as well, from the UK, agreeing to, under conditions, recognize Palestine, recognize Gaza as the genocide is ongoing, and the humanitarian crisis is ever increasing. I'm going to ignore entirely all these bizarre videos that Hamas is releasing of these Israeli hostages, these IDF soldiers who are, they look very, I would say, nutritionally deprived in some of these Hamas tunnels. Hamas is finally releasing footage of them to sort of prove that they're alive, I suppose. And the Israelis are saying, wow, look under which conditions these people are living on the ground and haven't seen the sun for over 18 months, etc. I think this is the least of Hamas's concerns when every time they come out of their tunnels, they see 100 dead Palestinians every single day. And the number, as you said, Conrad, it keeps building and building up. I think it's completely desensitized the Palestinians of Gaza. So at the moment, where we're very fortunate, and I think the Israelis are fortunate that the Palestinian people are even giving these hostages any sort of care whatsoever. And at the moment, we're looking at the Palestinian Hamas fighters holding at least 20 hostages, and there are at least 30 bodies of hostages which are being kept somewhere underground. I doubt they're being kept in, refrigerated sort of conditions, like in a morgue, like the Ukrainian and Russian bodies, which are currently being exchanged for Belarus. So it'll be interesting to see exactly how all of this plays out. But my hope, Conrad, is that, of course, Russia sticks to its strong policy of, kind of deterring itself from contacting Israel due to the fact that it needs to build up these friendly relations with Iran, with these Muslim countries. It needs to stick to one strategy. If Russia even comes out and positions itself as an Israeli-friendly nation, all of the relations it's been building with Iran, with Pakistan, for example, even with the Taliban in Afghanistan, they're going to collapse. So in some ways, I feel like trying to get Russia involved in the Israeli-Palestinian war is going to, again, it's going to be a tactic of trying to reduce Russia's popularity and clout amongst the Muslim nations to show Russia as a collaborative country in this whole sort of Zog globalist world order plan. At least this is one of my hypothetical, I think, ideas. And the Russian geopolitical analysts are also saying Russia shouldn't diplomatically get involved at all at the moment. However, again, it's hard to say this when we really want peace to arrive in the Middle East. We really want peace in Palestine to, of course, commence because there's been so many deaths. But at the same time, I think the onus is on Trump. The onus is on the Israeli leadership, who are now looking to, of course, invade the West Bank. Any week now, I think we'll see an escalation in the West Bank based on the rhetoric of the Israeli Knesset, of the cabinet of Netanyahu. It's not just a one-man decision by Netanyahu, but definitely I think it's on Trump and his administration to stop the war in Gaza. It's not on Putin, and certainly isn't on China or any of these BRICS countries.
Yeah, I completely hear you when it comes to who's whispering in Putin's ear with this sort of transnational negotiations. Putin stepping outside of his role as the leader of the Russians in the Russia-Ukraine war to then use that crisis and its clout to then negotiate it with America on behalf of Jewry and the Americans with the Iranians. This is all wrong. And I think, again, we talked about the whole Turkish situation, how the Russians are misjudging that. If that's the same attitude they're going to have, this is going to drive them all the wrong direction as well. And before I discuss some more details about Iran and specifically how, obviously we fear that the Russians will betray the Iranians for sort of assurances that their territorial objectives in Ukraine will be given to them without resistance from NATO. And this is a prophecy from St. Paisios, who he had people visiting him. And this says, one morning many years ago, as the elder sat in the courtyard of his cell with 5 or 6 visitors, he suddenly said, "Woe to the nations of the north." One of those present curiously asked, "Will there be poverty there, elder?" Since they had been discussing the global economic situation. "Fire will fall from the sky," the elder replied. Since this was during the Cold War between NATO and the USSR, another person asked, "Will there be a world war? Will NATO strike the Poles, the Czechoslovaks, the Belarusians, and will the Russians attack the Germans?" The elder shook his head and said, "Everyone will abandon the Russians and side with the Jews of America. The Russians will burn them." And again, this comes later when St. Paisios also talks about, basically reiterates what was said by St. Philomenos in 1978, that the Russians would make it down to Mount Tabor in their war against the Turks. And right now, again, with the global financial system, in many ways, we already have seen, the Jews of America already lined up against Russia. That frankly occurred in 2014, if not sooner. But so that prophecy has largely been fulfilled. But unfortunately, the Russians, in their loyalty to their quote unquote Jewish brothers and the Russian speakers in Israel, are walking themselves into a disaster, much like they are walking themselves into a disaster with their relations with Turkey and Azerbaijan, and potentially, if the Azeris and the Israelis get their way, these future Central Asian states, which would be a perfect place for the United States to launch all sorts of military operations against Russia and against a lot of their critical infrastructure and energy infrastructure. So with all of that, some big headline and scoop from Abbas Araghchi, Iranian foreign minister. This from the Jerusalem Post. He claimed there was no established ceasefire between Tehran and Jerusalem. This was an interview with the Iranian student news agency. He said the aggression has stopped, and in turn, our right to defend has stopped. Araghchi said, that's it. There is no ceasefire agreement. There is nothing else. They stopped the aggression without any conditions, and we stopped the defense. When there's no aggression, naturally, there's no reason to defend ourselves. So since they asked for the attacks to stop without any conditions, we accepted. Everything can resume. They can resume. We can resume. There is no official ceasefire, and everything is possible. And it's not just Iran that should be worried and concerned. In the same interview, the regime official asserted that it was necessary for the regime to continue enriching uranium, and that Iranian healthcare was dependent on an enrichment of at least 20%. He also talks about how before talks can resume with the United States, that compensation for the strikes that the United States did on Iran must be given. So that's sort of a way of saying that we don't want to negotiate because obviously the Trump is not going to compensate Iran for destroying their nuclear facilities. He's still openly every day bragging about how they destroyed the facilities, how at any day we could destroy them again, hinting at more strikes. Israel obviously perpetually rallying him for more strikes on the Houthis, more strikes on Iran, more strikes elsewhere. So, that's the current situation there. Araghchi, from the horse's mouth, there is no ceasefire. So in many ways, the quote unquote 12-day war is still ongoing. It's just, one trigger-happy Zionist away from erupting again. But this all comes amidst some reshuffling in Iran. This is from the Tehran Times. New Defense Council in works as Iran's officials affirm readiness against Israel. Tehran is set to activate a new Supreme Defense Council as part of significant structural changes within the Supreme National Security Council, according to reports from Iran's Fars and Tasnim news agencies. The council will reportedly consist of the following members. There will be the heads of the three branches of government, the president, who's now Pezeshkian, the chief justice, currently Mohsen Najeh, and the parliament speaker, Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf, who we've discussed before. There will be two personally appointed representatives of the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who would be determined in the future. The chief of staff of the Iranian Armed Forces, who is currently Major General Abdul Rahim Mousavi, the current General Commander-in-Chief of the IRGC, Brigadier General Mohammad Pakpour, the Commander-in-Chief of Iran's Army, Major General Amir Khatami, and the Minister of Intelligence, Ismail Khatib, as well as the Commander of the Khatam al-Anbiya Joint Headquarters, currently unknown. It's suspected that is Brigadier General Ali Abadi. So this is sort of a new dynamic group of people who, I don't know if this list was published for no other reason than to get these people assassinated by Mossad. I'm assuming they have a super secret, powerful bunker. Perhaps they can put this war council in to prevent all these people from being destroyed. Maybe this was done in response to chain of command issues during the 12-day war, considering how extensive Israel's assassination of IRGC as well as Iranian army and navy officials really were during that war. So interesting developments there, of course. We already discussed the countries that are about to recognize Palestine. We discussed even before how the SNP, the far left parties, were able to, I think they were effectively pressuring the UK to recognize Palestine because they were going to force that vote. Then just a day later, after he recorded that, Keir Starmer announced that they were going to join the French in doing that. So effective third-party lobbying from the Scottish nationalists in the UK. But this is from antiwar.com before I hand it over to you, Dimitri. Israel launches heavy airstrikes against eastern Lebanon, raising fear of escalation. Israel looked to be dramatically escalating the number and intensity of airstrikes it is carrying out against Lebanon today, with at least 7 strikes reported in the northeast area around Bekaa Valley and Baalbek, as well as a number of other strikes reported against southern Lebanon. And Baalbek, Bekaa Valley, this is close to the Valley of the Christians. These are heavily Orthodox areas within Lebanon, some places majority, if not exclusively Orthodox. So our greatest ally. Defense Minister Israel Katz blamed the Bekaa Valley strikes targeting Hezbollah's biggest precision missile site, and associated infrastructure site. Strikes in the area were also reported in the Baalbek district. Elsewhere in the east, strikes targeted Brital, as well as the border town of Janta along the Syrian border. Further to the south, attacks were reported in the Jazin district and also in the town of Nasiriyah. At least 4 people were reported killed in the strikes, though the toll may rise. And remember, there's ostensibly still a Lebanon ceasefire in place. This is just how Israel rolls. Lebanese President Joseph Aoun called for Hezbollah's full disarmament in keeping with the ongoing U.S. demands to unconditionally disarm them. So Israel bombs your country. The president of that country then comes out and says, yeah, the only people in our country fighting the people bombing us, you need to disarm immediately. Must suck being Lebanese, man. I mean, I get the country is sort of fake and it's this patchwork country, but it must be terrible that you're such a client and so delicate and so poorly put together that you have to perpetually fight against the only people that are standing up against Israel. He suggested that the lack of disarmament gave Israel a pretext to continue attacking, even though the U.S. envoy already made clear that they have no intention of calling for Israel to stop attacking, even if Lebanon gives in to all demands, which we discussed in the last 2 shows. Hezbollah leader Naim Qassem once again rejected the call to unilaterally disarm, saying the calls amount to a demand to submit to Israel, which they have no intention of doing. Hezbollah has repeatedly rejected disarmament while Israel continues to attack and continues to occupy Lebanese territory, though that hasn't stopped ongoing U.S. demands to do so anyway. The IDF claimed that most of the sites they attacked today were underground, and therefore it's probably impossible to know what, if anything, was actually hit or destroyed. They claimed Hezbollah was in the process of restoring the sites, but offer no evidence that this was the case. So, Dimitri, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Iran situation, as well as Lebanon, Gaza, the West Bank, because obviously the genocide is continuing. And of course, with everything going on with Turkey and Azerbaijan, with Russia, unfortunately, Russia's days of being able to do much more in Syria are also sort of out the window. We're also going to have to talk about Syria in a second, but I'd love to get your thoughts on these other ones before we discuss what's going on with the Druze and then what's going on with the SDF there.
No, of course, it's incredibly sensitive what's happening. Obviously, there's a fake ceasefire happening with Lebanon, with Hezbollah, and Hezbollah being pressured both by its own government, because they are citizens they are supposed to answer to. Joseph Aoun, the president of Lebanon, clearly Naim Qassem is in a very difficult position because he didn't receive any orders to attack Israel during the 12-day war between Iran and Israel, which I think was very curious. It's almost as if, one, either Hezbollah is that much damaged and is unprepared to actually strike Israel again, sort of to renew hostilities, or 2, he's actually been told internally that, look, the country of Lebanon, it is several degrees away from actually being engulfed in a new civil war. Do not provoke Israel right now. Like, we are suffering losses. The Israelis are harassing us. They're bombing us. But please, Hezbollah, do not engage Israel at all. We understand your Shia loyalties to the IRGC and the Iranian revolution, but you cannot, of course, push the envelope. We need to preserve the sovereignty of Lebanon to save it from turning into a new Syria with these crazy jihadis and the country being divided and essentially disarmed forever, which I think is one of these looming threats that Lebanon faces clearly. And of course, as Lebanon is destabilized, Israel is going to move in as the peacekeeper, as they're doing in the southwest of Syria, right? In these provinces, fighting against these evil Bedouin/ISIS militants. And again, Israel is just going to benefit from that destabilization. So cannot be sort of more sympathetic towards Hezbollah, but I do need to state that they are, between a rock and a hard place at the moment. They're facing a lot of, I think, pressure from within and from without. It's very clear. And again, the West Bank, as I said earlier, there's been over 700 to 800 deaths in the West Bank, mostly unrecorded. Christians, Muslims have been killed since the 7th of October. And we haven't seen any condemnations from the Arab governments, actually, of these deaths since the 7th of October. In fact, just recently at the United Nations, the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority of Fatah, obviously the right-hand man of Mahmoud Abbas, Mohammed Mustafa, he was at the UN General Assembly in New York, and he gave a big speech. And he asked that all the Arab and Muslim countries condemn the 7th of October, as a terror act. And they did. In fact, we had Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Turkey. All the majority Arab countries, including even Turkey itself, condemned the 7th of October. I mean, this is just the 7th of October. We are like almost 2 years removed from that particular event. There's been a lot more death, especially carried on at the behest of Israel and by Israel since then. I think it's time to sort of move on. Condemning the 7th of October right now is just a virtue signaling PR stunt. There's bigger issues to discuss in the Middle East, especially since there's literally a terroristic regime in Syria, which Turkey supported. There is clearly still Palestinian innocent people being killed. And, at least discuss at least a hostage situation with Hamas rather than simply signaling to the world that, look, we are Sunni Muslims and we condemn the 7th of October, it's not going to do anyone any good. And it's not going to help the Palestinians in the West Bank either. So very concerning sort of consensus coming out from the Sunni Muslim world there at the United Nations. But I just wanted to mention briefly the Azerbaijan-Russian relations, because that clearly affects Iran. And Iran, I think, very anxiously is watching its northern borders as to what's happening between Pashinyan, Aliyev, President Putin, and the complications that Aliyev is creating for the Russo-Iranian Union. Because if you think about it, Conrad, beyond the Caspian Sea, there is no real connection, even geographically speaking, between Iran and Russia. And the Caspian Sea at the moment is like the only connecting route between the two countries which are opposing essentially NATO and its allies in the Middle East and Europe. So keeping that in mind, there's been a recent development, quite negative, I would say, in terms of former CSTO countries. Azerbaijan, for the first time in its history, has officially sent LNG, liquefied natural gas, by ship from Turkey. And this is the major Azeri national company, Sokar, sent liquefied natural gas to Odessa, and then, of course, delivered some of this gas to Ukraine, but also to Romania and Bulgaria. So they're calling this the Trans-Balkan gas trade route that Azerbaijan wants to develop with Ukraine. So they've signed a certain deal of gas exchanges between Azerbaijan and Ukraine. How bizarre. Like Aliyev, does he know what he's getting into? Is he trying to provoke Russia? I mean, this is causing an immense amount of anxiety in the Russian, among the Russians, because given the Azeri domination of certain Russian economic fields, but it's also creating a very complicated situation. And we're not too sure how Putin will respond to this. Very interestingly, Conrad, Putin actually just this week posthumously awarded one of the Azeri men who was present at Crocus City Hall in March of 2024 during Purim, who was slain, a man named Husseinov. He was actually killed because one of the Tajik terrorists shot a spray of bullets, and he actually, with his own body, blocked a few women catching these bullets and essentially dying to protect some innocent people. Husseinov was awarded posthumously, and he's an Azeri citizen who was present at Crocus City Hall. And President Putin awarded this Azeri posthumously, just one man, but notice he's an Azerbaijani. So it's very clear that Putin wants to send a signal to Aliyev that, look, we still respect our relationship with Azerbaijan, even though you guys are clearly supporting Ukraine, supporting Erdogan. I'm not sure what exactly the Russian administration is what kind of situation they're trying to save, because it's clearly not going in their favor. Awarding Mr. Husseinov with a posthumous, award of courage isn't going to change the geopolitical landscape of Aliyev clearly being anti-Russian at this point. And at the same time, to sort of counteract this positive move towards Russo-Azeri relations, one of the biggest, I would say, local oligarchs from Yekaterinburg, Shahin Shuklinsky, a very big man, and I don't mean big as in monetary value, I mean big as in body weight. He's at least 400 pounds, if not more. He's giant. I will say he's the biggest Azeri I've ever seen. He was arrested by FSB as he left the Azeri consulate in Moscow. But mind you, he's the leader of the Azeri diaspora in Yekaterinburg, where all of these recent criminal acts took place and where the arrest of the two Azeris who were killed in custody as well happened. So the Russian federal forces, put this big man on the ground, arrested him, and have taken him into custody in the middle of Moscow at the Azerbaijan consulate. So clearly a big power move from the Russian sort of State Department. But in sort of covering this, the other very interesting news, clearly Azerbaijan is trying to develop some sort of gas alternative route to Europe. And this is a theory which has been put out by Lev Vershilin. I trust Lev Vershilin's analysis in the Middle East, but I have to keep in mind he is half Jewish, right? I believe he has an Israeli citizenship as well. He currently lives outside of Russia, but in terms of Russian geopolitics, he gives a pretty clear, he gave a clear prediction in January of this year that Iran would be attacked by Israel. And his prediction came true. Like he said earlier this year, that's exactly what will happen. So I'm not saying he actually, looks at Orthodox Christian foreign policy and prophetic predictions, but I think generally speaking, he is someone very well informed. He said the following, and he considers himself a Russian patriot, not a Jewish Israeli patriot. He said that Aliyev, Erdogan, and Berim Muhamedov, at least the Berim Muhamedov clan, which is running Turkmenistan, is planning to create an alternative gas route for Europe so that Europe is no longer reliant on Russia. Mind you, at the moment, it's estimated that Europe imports between 14% and 19% of all of its gas from Russia and Belarus at the moment for these gas pipelines, which we've discussed throughout the entire year. And Turkmenistan has 10% of the world's gas, in its gas fields. Now, Turkmenistan is very disconnected from Europe. Obviously, you would need to create a pipeline going under the Caspian Sea through Azerbaijan, through Armenia. Again, the Zangezur corridor comes into this equation, through Turkey into Europe, essentially weaning Europe off of this addiction to Russian gas and turning all of these Central and Eastern European countries like Austria, Hungary, Slovakia, which is Prime Minister Fico being there, all these countries which are seemingly pro-Russian, like they're Russian-leaning, shall we say, and they kind of model their presidencies and executive power structures on President Putin in a way. They try to copy Lukashenko, they try to copy Putin, and they try to copy Donald Trump, of course. They're very pro-MAGA, trying to isolate them away from Russia by having an alternative gas source presented through Turkmenistan, through the Turkic world, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Turkey. It's a very interesting sort of coalition that will be created if Aliyev, of course, has his way. I mean, this is a big hypothetical speculation going forward, but I think if it comes to pass, this was one of the strategies, I think, that both NATO, and again, Turkey is has the second largest NATO country, has the second largest NATO army after the US, is preparing in order to weaken Russia's presence in Europe. So to make sure that no more of these right-wing pro-Russian parties win any further elections just because Europe needs to rely on cheap Russian gas. Turkmenistan at the moment, of course, is supplying most of its gas to China and Iran. However, if things change, they can always supply gas through this new gas route all the way to Europe. So this is very negative for Russia. Again, it isolates Russia from Europe. It also isolates Russia almost entirely from those Turkic southern countries. And, really, geopolitically speaking, this is a constrictive move, almost like a big python. The world, essentially globalism in and of itself, will negatively impact Russia in the long term, especially since Russia heavily relies on gas and oil trades. So kind of speaking to this, we had further developments. The country just north of Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan's largest gas and oil company, Kazmunay, which we'll just call KMG, the abbreviation KMG. So this is Kazakhstan's biggest company by market capital at all, like not just gas and oil, but in all of Kazakhstan, this is the largest corporation. It allied with Turkish Petroleum, the largest Turkish oil company. And now they're exploring further gas and oil fields in Kazakhstan. And this recently happened because Tokayev, the president of Kazakhstan, visited Erdogan in Turkey, and they've signed a deal to have KMG and Turkish Petroleum cooperate for the first time. So we're seeing, Kazakhstan is still on friendly grounds of Russia. In fact, recently Kazakhstan has signed an agreement to increase the oil shipments through Kazakhstan to China, Russian oil, from 7 to 10 million tons per year. So it's quite a big increase. But Kazakhstan at the same time is double dipping. It's allying itself both with Russia and China, at the same time with its Turkic neighbors, as we saw with Tokayev's recent visit and this new KMG, Turkish Petroleum collaboration. So there's some really, behind the scenes, some huge machinations taking place there on Russia's southern border. And we have to never forget where all the drug, narcotic, weapons, human smuggling trades, all these other things, they all somehow connect to Kazakhstan because it does serve as this Russian vulnerable underbelly, the borders of which are not protected. When we speak about America, of course, you have Mexico, through which a lot of these criminal networks operate. And again, Kazakhstan serves the same purpose for Russia, very unfortunately, because the two countries are essentially, they were so closely aligned in the 90s and the early 2000s. I think the situation has deteriorated quite immensely. So again, there's a lot of pressure on President Putin and people like Dmitry Medvedev and all these other officials in Russia to make the correct moves. But as you can see, Conrad, the Turkish world seems to be very much aligned with Trump, with Netanyahu and NATO against Russia at the moment. It appears to be so.
The situation in these Central Asian countries is very fascinating, especially from the World War Now perspective. I think most people see the Stan countries and even Azerbaijan and their eyes glaze over. They're like, what are these irrelevant countries that no one cares about? But when you understand the pan-Turkic strategy, if you watch our video with George McMillan, and then you, of course, factor the prophecies in with that, you really start to get a fascinating picture of what is coming down the pipe here. And it's massive, and it is, very much something that is the Third World War in an undeniable way. And in the midst of all of that, this is from Reuters headline, Trump eyes bringing Azerbaijan, Central Asian nations into Abraham Accords, sources say. President Donald Trump's administration is actively discussing with Azerbaijan the possibility of bringing that nation and some Central Asian allies into the Abraham Accords, hoping to deepen their existing ties with Israel, according to 5 sources with knowledge of the matter. As part of the Abraham Accords, inked in 2020 and 2021, during Trump's first term in office, 4 Muslim-majority countries agreed to normalize diplomatic relations with Israel after U.S. mediation. Azerbaijan and every country in Central Asia, by contrast, already have long-standing relations with Israel, meaning that an expansion of the accords to include them would be largely symbolic. focusing on strengthening ties in areas like trade and military cooperation, said the sources who requested anonymity to discuss private conversations. It goes on to talk about how Saudi Arabia is refusing to recognize Israel without assurances on a Palestinian state. Saudi Arabia are the ones that are leading the UN delegation meeting about recognizing Palestine with France. The idea is sort of that Saudi Arabia will be the main sponsor and custodian of the future Fatah, Palestinian Authority recognized, sort of run Palestinian state here. But you mentioned, of course, the major cooperations between Tokayev and Erdogan, which was at the fifth meeting of the Turkey-Kazakhstan High-Level Strategic Cooperation Council, which the fact that that even exists shows how strongly Kazakhstan over the past few years has been moving towards its Turkic roots. I'm wondering, I guess, if we could perhaps conclude that the Tokayev power struggle over Nazarbayev or whoever else was involved in that power struggle was effectively moving them away from Russia, moving them into this Turkish sphere of influence. But of course, the other Turkish related news is their designation of their marine parks, which are these sort of protected natural areas in the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea all around Turkey's maritime borders. They are excluding certain Greek maritime water regions, claiming them as their own. This all ties into St. Paisios's prophecies about the 6 miles, the nautical miles, the economic zones, and a future, sort of confrontation between Turkey and Greece that will result in a few islands being taken before, the big clash comes between Russia and Turkey proper. So all very relevant things. Turkey always sort of the linchpin moving us towards the true civilizational conflict. And not only are they acting against Greece, are they acting against Russia, are they acting through their influence in Azerbaijan, but they are, of course, also pretty much the main actor outside of Israel in Syria. There's a big dispute right now between the SDF and the Syrian forces over an attack that occurred in the northern city of Manbij, which left several soldiers dead. People are trading blame as to who started it. The SDF has been extremely reticent to fully integrate with the Damascus government. Of course, they are the most powerful force right now with international United States backing, 100,000 plus troops under a single commander. So they are effectively the most powerful force outside of the government right now acting within Syria. So they're not going lightly. And of course, they have their relations with the Kurds. Turkey, they're the ones aggressing against them the most. It's specifically the Turkish-backed factions within the Syrian National Army that are reported to be trading these off and on blows with different SDF factions, in their controlled territory. The SDF has apparently been building up certain areas, indicating that they don't actually plan on integrating with the government there. We'll see how, there's rumors that Iranian forces from Iraq are going to be integrating and infiltrating Syria more and more. Interesting to see how that would be sort of a three-way clash between SNA, Iranian-backed troops, and the SDF. That was sort of how things were going in Syria for a very long time. 3-4-way clashes between factions that were all aligned against each other. But as all this is going on, of course, in the northeast of Syria, this very similar situation actually is occurring between the quote-unquote Bedouin tribes and the Druze backed by Israel in As-Suwaida near the Dara region. The Druze were apparently moving all the way up near the border of the Dada region, setting up armed, checkpoints, digging in, building barriers, these sorts of things. There have apparently been off and on clashes there. People are trying to get aid into the region because there's still, fallout from massacres and the actual clashes that occurred weeks ago. So there's a lot of confusion as to what's actually occurring right now. But as far as I'm aware, the Druze Council, the military council, I think it's the Southern Military Council, have effectively, again, declared autonomy from Syria. They have the protection of the Israeli forces. They're putting Israeli flags up everywhere. Druze Israeli sort of union flags are being seen all over the place, and they're digging in, and it doesn't seem like the Syrian forces have actually been able to get in there. And of course, Israel, with the support of the United States, seems to be allowing them to support this Druze separatism, effectively, that's occurring at a small city-by-city scale currently within Syria. So that's the situation that's going on there. And I think Turkey is a connecting factor to almost all of these. I think outside of Israel itself, it is the most dynamic actor in this region right now.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly concerning. And, just viewing Turkey as a former imperial superstructure that was competing with the Arabs for a long time, I think we can finally see that in reality, again, the Middle East is still divided between the three Muslim main ethnoses, the main national groups which create policy in the Middle East. That is the Persians, you have the Turkic people, Turkey itself, the Central Asians, and then you have the Arabs. And again, the newest member in this sort of coalition to fight against many of these Muslims, who sort of carries their own weight, is again Israel itself, was representing a much darker, I would say, much more devious entity. Of course, the Israelis, the Zog globalism in and of itself. I think when you see the Middle East generally, Conrad, sort of moving towards what we can, I think, conclude as the division of Syria, like Syria being divided between Israel, the Arabs, most definitely recently Barack, and I always try to call him Barack Obama, but the U.S. envoy to the Middle East recently meeting with Qatar, actually guaranteeing Qatari gas for very cheap prices for Syria. It's almost as if these various countries are collaborating in order to either rebuild Syria or to remodel it according to its own standards. I think we have to never lose sight of the fact that the Syrian war, the division of this particular land, the two countries behind it primarily wasn't just Israel, it was Turkey and it was Qatar, right? And unfortunately, in Doha, you still have a huge base camp of Hamas fighters. And I think Russia understands this. Like Russia really closely, I think, understands the relationship between HTS, Hamas, Qatar, and the war effort that they put in, the investment they put into the Syrian revolution to down the Assad regime, which was Russia's forepost in the Middle East, Russia's base. And again, Russia still has de facto those two bases, which we haven't seen any real action in recently, besides, of course, saving the asylum seekers on the west coast of Syria. But just keeping all of this in mind, I think Russia very clearly understands that the Middle East is becoming a land very far away from it, like it's losing all of its influence. And you have this huge division of Syria between the two main parties, that is the Arabs, the rich Arabs, and you have the Turks. This is the reality I think we're facing at the moment. Unfortunately for the Syrian people, they're just turning into what they were for many centuries. Like one of these ethnicities, the Arabized Syrians, they are the people who are like being molded into whichever form the country that dominates them wishes them to become. So just similar to what was happening during the Crusades, when they had to choose between, of course, being loyal servants of the Kingdom of Jerusalem or to, of course, align with Salah ad-Din. Today as well, they will either align with the Turks or they'll align with the Arabs. They will not have any sort of sovereign independence. That 50-year reign of the Assads is well and truly over. I don't think it'll be returning. And in fact, just speaking about this, Conrad, there is a rumor coming out that Assad will be releasing a video response very soon from Russia. And again, this is a pure speculation, pure rumor that appeared on X, Twitter, that Assad will be releasing a video explanation of what exactly happened in Syria and his perspective on the entire event. But at the moment, I think Russia's making a really big mistake, Conrad, again, ignoring the threat of this Turkey-built Central Asian issue, as well as the investment all these countries are putting into the HTS regime in Syria, which is generally unfriendly to Russia. Like they have painted Russia over decades, right, over the last decade at least, as the evil white Christian crusaders. That's the image the Sunni Muslim radicals have been marking Russia as. And for Russia to work with these sort of people, and again, the Ramzan Kadyrov angle, again, is very important here because the Chechens are pro-HTS. So it's a very dangerous game that the Russians are playing.
No, it's true. And in the midst of all these meetings between, for example, Erdogan and Tokayev, people are reminded of all of the trade routes that are, sort of the underlying cause of many of these conflicts with Gaza. We know about the Leviathan gas fields and the IMEC corridor connection, and regarding Kazakhstan and Turkey. And this obviously connects to the Azerbaijan-Turkey gas route that wants to bypass Russia. There's, of course, the Trans-Caspian international transport route, commonly referred to as the Middle Corridor. And Tokayev recently shared data, approximately 85% of road freight transported between China and Europe passes through Kazakhstan. This positions Kazakhstan as a backbone of the region's logistics infrastructure. Turkey's central role in the Middle Corridor makes it a decisive actor in the route's integration with Europe. In this regard, Kazakhstan's efforts to modernize its rail and road infrastructure, alongside its revival of maritime transport on the Caspian Sea, when combined with Turkey's port capacity and transportation infrastructure, present significant synergistic potential. So this is a massive project that would be connecting China, Central Asia, directly with Europe, completely bypassing Russia, even territory that Russia, at least right now, has any ability to reclaim or have influence over, especially when you put the Zangezur corridor into the mix with the supposed rumor that a U.S. firm will eventually be taken over. I think the Russians are at this point, hopefully, and I mean, they should be scrambling their soft power influence to try to get something done in Armenia, perhaps work to get things done more in Georgia, influence Azerbaijan more. They should have, I'm sorry, but the Russians should have backed Armenia in a full-scale war against Azerbaijan and helped them win. That unironically would have prevented so much of this happening. But
Well, yeah,
you live and you learn. Hindsight is 2020, right?
clearly. And in the Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, like there are statues there which are recently, as the Azeris obviously have been destroying Christian churches in their region as well, but they've recently destroyed a statue to a Russian Armenian famous painter, Ayvazovsky. He, that Russian imperial 19th century painter who we all remember had these great paintings. He was from Crimea himself, but he would color and draw these great images of Sevastopol and the Russian ports, and I guess the various imagery we have of 19th century Russian imperial Ukraine comes from this Armenian Russian Ayvazovsky. His biggest statue in Armenia today, which was located in Nagorno-Karabakh, actually was destroyed by the Azeris. So they just simply demolished the statue, and he's considered as one of the great cultural painters of the Russian imperial period. So this shows you how much actual respect Azeris give towards the Armenian-Russian relationship.
No, it's true. And unfortunately, at this point, I'm not sure the Russians are as hip to, even from a basic geostrategic perspective, what we're talking about, let alone the civilizational reality of the prophetic events that are about to unfold before our eyes, right? But we got to pivot away. We're already an hour and a half in. We have to discuss a few other regions. And of course, this was a big headline. There was some British news. Sky News was in Taiwan for a special report titled, "Is Taiwan Ready for a Chinese Invasion?" And this headline is from the Taipei Times. "China preparing to invade Taiwan," says Deputy Foreign Minister Francois Wu, who is the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs for the self-declared autonomous Chinese region of Taiwan, with its capital in Taipei. They claim to be their own country, despite even according to the United States being recognized as part of China. This movie that was made, it's sort of a big piece of Western propaganda to help people understand the Taiwanese push for armament and defense against mainland China. Of course, Taiwan is, deeply politically divided. There's this more liberal Americanist party in power right now, but the mayor of Taipei, many other powerful people are part of the Kuomintang, the more nationalist party, who at this point are much more willing to explore, future paths to integration with China. I've been recently DMing with Steve Su, who's sort of an expert on all of this from a military technology perspective and, of course, a Chinese culture and Taiwanese relations, foreign policy perspective. So hopefully we can be having him on soon, because it seems like the United States is pivoting to the Pacific without wrapping up the situations in the Middle East and Ukraine. So we're looking at a minimum sort of three-front world war with the U.S. sort of directly involved. So shaping up for quite a mess, unfortunately. But it would be great to talk to Steve Su in the future. But the other big news from Asia, following up on our previous show from last week, is that the ceasefire brokered by Malaysia and assisted by the United States between Thailand and Cambodia largely seems to be holding. Malaysia seems to have even reaped a last-minute reduction in the tariff rate that Donald Trump imposed on many Southeast Asian countries. Supposedly, they're about to face a 26% tariff, but it went down to 19% as sort of a reward for helping broker the ceasefire of the war that was starting to get pretty bloody. And again, even in the midst of, there have already been some ceasefire violations, so we can't necessarily say it's going to hold yet. There's going to have to be negotiations before we can say the conflict is officially over. But over 250,000 civilians were displaced across both sides of the border, 100 plus soldiers killed on the Cambodian side, at least 175 soldiers killed on the Thai side. And these are admitted numbers, so it's likely much higher than that. So this was a real conflict. This was a real war, and it's likely something that could brew in the background if the U.S. and China continue to clash through soft power and through proxies, across all these different regions. So Asia obviously is still an extremely important region, and it's still sort of the main place where I think the U.S., at least in the actual Americans, not necessarily the Jews or people involved in these other parts of the world, Eurasia, I think, or Eastern Europe and the Middle East, it appears that the actual Americans do want to pivot, from an economic perspective, at least towards China. So all these interests are going to be, discussed congruently. But I think the other Asian story that everyone sort of thought would be bigger was the massive 8.8 earthquake, off the coast of Kamchatka, off the coast of Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, the city out there in Russia, which triggered tsunamis on Japan, supposedly triggered tsunamis in Oregon and California on the West Coast, but nobody died in the midst of all of this. There was some damage and some tsunami flooding in Russia. A kindergarten was effectively destroyed, but everyone seems to have evacuated Hawaii, Japan, Russia. It seems that no casualties occurred because of this. So this seemed like a big nothing burger out of what was ostensibly otherwise a very major geological event.
Oh no, of course it was cataclysmic, and it's very fortunate that I guess the tectonic plates, or whatever the theory is of these how these earthquakes even formulated in the first place. It took place, and of course, the fallout mainly around Petropavlovsk itself. There was great footage, of course, that the Russians released. I don't believe there are any casualties at the moment. There are some injuries. President Putin actually, with his meeting of Lukashenko, he openly stated that a lot of the doctors who provided first aid in this particular instance on Russian soil because of the earthquake, they will receive government awards. So obviously something equivalent to service on the front lines, providing first aid. Doctors are treated with a lot of respect in Russia. I think generally speaking, a lot more than people of other professions. I think it's always been Russian medicine has always been a field of high respect during the Russian imperial period, during the Crimean War, and even during the Soviet period. So, we just have to bring up St. Luke of Crimea, of course, and as an example. So Russians respect their doctors, and President Putin openly stated that the Russians will be doing anything needed if Japan asks for any assistance, given the fallout. But we didn't really see necessarily any gigantic, shall we say, tsunami waves, anything like from that Hollywood has been providing us. So it's very interesting how this 8.8 grade earthquake really hasn't caused as much fallout as equivalent to, say, Fukushima, which was a great disaster in Japan. So I think let's just pray that there's no further developments coming out from this. It's a lot less of there was a lot less of an impactful event, Conrad, I would say, comparatively to the South Turkish, Northern Syrian earthquake, which shook the Idlib province and destroyed a lot of the ruins in the ancient city of Antioch and Aleppo as well, which took place, I believe, in 2023. That was a much more significant event, so that particular Turkish earthquake. And I think in some capacity, a lot of people blamed Erdogan for not actually preparing a lot of these Turkish suburbs with proper infrastructural defenses against such natural disasters. But I think as these wars progress, right, we can only see the earth and it's like nature itself reacting to the sin among people, spilling blood, of course, serving the devil in their various sort of pursuits. And I think the war between Cambodia and Thailand, fighting over pagan temples. I mean, if this doesn't spell disaster for the local people, I don't know what will. I mean, besides cultural, what value do these temples serve? Do they actually provide a reason for hundreds of people to die? And by hundreds of people, I mean the official number, Conrad, between the Thailand and Cambodian war. Yes, officially, Thailand stated that 15 of their soldiers have died, but they've killed over 100 Cambodians, right? Just over the 7 days, which is quite a big number, I would say. As well as the Cambodians have openly stated that they've slain many members of the Thailand Royal Marines as well. So it's been quite a bloody exchange. And I don't know if we want to call it a 7-day or a 10-day war, depending on when the actual long-term peace treaty is signed between the two countries. But from what we can see at the moment, the predictions, Conrad, have been exactly correct, that Cambodia was actually the more US-aligned nation, despite its somewhat close ties to China, because Cambodia came out with a very comical headline. They've proposed to provide Trump a Nobel, they've nominated President Donald J. Trump for a Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prize equivalent to that received by President Obama in the past decade for, organizing the Thailand-Cambodia truce. This mimics, of course, Bibi Netanyahu proposing to give President Trump the Nobel Peace Prize for resolving the Pakistan-Indian War. Again, I don't think in reality Trump actually has done anything here. I think Malaysia should be winning accolades here to sort of facilitate talks between the two countries. But in the end, these tensions, right? Obviously, Thailand seems to be very pro-Chinese in this particular case, and Cambodia very pro-American. They can only spill over even more so if there is a further conflict between America and China and their allies and proxies in the region, because this all ties into the whole Taiwan situation. Like, these conflicts are very limited in their capacity. I mean, they're fighting over temple, jungle grounds. Yes, I guess they have cultural significance. However, the real fight for the money will take place over Taiwan. And this is what a lot of the fear and warmongers are speaking about, especially the Taiwanese foreign minister, who officially stated that China is preparing an amphibian or a naval operation against Taiwan. So this is officially now being stated by the cabinet members of the Taiwanese government. I'm not sure what exact figures they have. Have their spies reported something from China? Or is China actually really preparing to strike at Taiwan? Have they met a certain deadline? If you recall, Conrad, back in 2022 and 2023, we predicted that around this year, there will be further escalations in China, in Taiwan, in the East, because of the finalization of that semiconductor microprocessing plant, which was being constructed in Arizona by the TSMC, the company in Thailand, which creates these, microprocessors we all have in our mobile phones, the Androids, the iPhones, the laptops, etc., these very key chips which exist in all high-end technologies. And now that Thailand has moved, sorry, now that Taiwan has moved a lot of this industry over into the US, or at least they're constructing two of these big facilities in Arizona, finally maybe there's been a certain green lighting behind the scenes, and the globalists are saying, look, maybe a Taiwanese-Chinese conflict is finally possible, and maybe we actually will see an escalation there in the Pacific.
Yes, China not only is, moving on Taiwan, but the perpetual, disputes with the Philippines over these shoals, more and more disputes off the coast of North Korea with Japan, the situation, of course, in Thailand and Cambodia, having to do then with Vietnam on the other side. There's so much, going on, so many countries that are intertwined in all of this that it's hard to keep up with, especially with, all these tiny Southeast Asian countries that are largely U.S. outposts and exist to be sort of Israeli-U.S. votes in the United Nations. But we're going to be watching it very closely. And of course, I wouldn't be surprised if the U.S. continues to poke China to the point where China not escalating starts to seem like weakness, to the point where they may be pressured into making a decision they may not want to make. But hopefully we can talk to Steve Su about this in the future. But before we move on to discussing any church news or anything like that, we do have to discuss the persecution of our good friend Milorad Dodik, the Bosnian Serb, the leader of Republika Srpska. This is from, unfortunately, a Turkish news source, but it was the most recent source. Bosnia and Herzegovina's appeals court has confirmed the February verdict against Milorad Dodik, president of Republika Srpska, affirming his sentence of 1 year in prison and a 6-year ban on public office. Following the appeals ruling, Dodik had a press conference where he once again rejected the authority of the OHR, which is the High Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and its decisions, declaring, "This is an attack on Republika Srpska. I reject the ruling, and as long as I remain in power, there will be no early elections in Republika Srpska. I'm calling for police intervention." In June 2023, Republika Srpska's National Assembly decided not to publish the decisions made by High Representative Christian Schmidt in its official gazette. Although Schmidt announced that his decision was invalid and would not be enforced, the NSRS still went ahead and put it into effect. Because Dodik refused to follow the OHR's decisions, prosecutors filed a case against him. He attended his first court hearing on December 16, 2023. Later, the Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina found Dodik guilty of ignoring the OHR's decisions and sentenced him to 1 year in prison and banned him from politics for 6 years. In July 2025, Dodik voluntarily appeared before the prosecutor's office in Sarajevo, leading to the lifting of an arrest warrant against him. However, authorities have warned that the warrant could be reinstated if he continues actions deemed unconstitutional. Dodik had been charged with threatening the constitutional order. According to media sources, he voluntarily appeared at the prosecutor's office, accompanied by a lawyer, to provide a statement. The European Union on Friday urged all parties to respect the appeal court's decision, emphasizing the independence and impartiality of the judiciary. The EU calls on all parties to acknowledge the independence and impartiality of the court and to respect and uphold its verdict, stated the EU's diplomatic service in response to Dodik's prison sentence, AFP reported. So, obviously, the warrant seems to be sort of nebulous in the sense that they want him to come to court, and he is for some reason, but then they won't arrest him. But now he does have to serve his sentence, so I'm assuming he won't be going to Sarajevo again anytime soon. But unfortunately, this persecution, ironically, the Kosovo, Bosnia-Herzegovina situation, St. Paisios does mention this being a flashpoint that could flare up in the middle of the Third World War, so it's something to watch very closely. Obviously, there have been escalations in Kosovo too that we're monitoring, but the situation, obviously, with Srpska has been very much ongoing. We've been talking about it since, honestly, the very beginning of the show, because Republika Srpska has effectively been existing in a state of, independent statehood, not recognized by anyone but itself for a very long time now. So it's an interesting conflict. Before we move on to any other issues, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, Dimitri.
These are quite big news, I think, in relation to Dodik. Clearly, he is still positioning himself as one of the leaders of the Serbian world, much more right-wing, much more pro-Russian than Vučić is, and I think even closer to the Orthodox Church. And yet we have to disregard the sort of position that he has towards Israel, Zionism. We have to understand most of these countries, which were at one point occupied by the Ottoman Empire, they do have a strong disliking towards Sunni Muslims in general, right? I think it's a very sensitive issue for them. It's very much, they never were threatened by the Israelis. They never saw themselves as, Serbia itself and in Bosnia-Herzegovina, I believe the two countries combined have less than 3,000 Jews living in them. So these people have never even encountered the threat, of course, that Zionism carries. So Milorad Dodik, I think when he speaks out in favor of Israel over, say, Hamas and Palestine, we have to kind of take this with a grain of salt. And I think maybe even is uninformed on the issue, frankly, because he is a local politician, mind you. He's a local sort of leader of Republika Srpska. He understands the pressure that the Muslims of Bosnia, which is, they make up the majority of the government. These are NATO-supported Muslims as well, so they're not necessarily even conservative in any capacity. And we also understand the alliance that NATO makes of certain Muslim countries, like the NATO state of Turkey and, of course, the Gulf states. So I think Milorad Dodik at this point is basically, I don't want to call him a Russian agent, but he's definitely a herald of the Russian world in the Balkans, and probably the most vocal one of all. I mean, if Kalin Georgescu won the election in Romania, if that wasn't stolen from him, I think Russia would have essentially two spokespersons that would essentially support a revanchism of pan-Slavism in the Balkans. But at this point, it's only Milorad Dodik, and this is why Bosnia is really trying to push against him. And we just have to remember the fact that people like Igor Strelkov, for example, most likely he has a connection to Milorad Dodik as well, because Strelkov was in Bosnia during that particular war when Yugoslavia was falling apart. There's a lot of very based and, I guess, right-wing Orthodox Christian connections that the Bosnian Serbs have to Russia, which I think live on to this day. It's one of these last remaining outposts of, I don't want to say it like a Russian proxy, but definitely one of the last connections that live on. And of course, Patriarch Porphyrios, we have to remember of Serbia, how he recently, a few months ago, traveled to Russia, and he said that one of our strongest secret weapons is President Putin. I mean, he probably said that very earnestly, but that can be seen as quite a dramatic remark geopolitically, because President Putin, for all intents and purposes, he is supportive of Orthodox Christianity. As we'll speak about in a minute in relation to church news, President Putin and people like even Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, they have come out in support of the church in many instances, and their position has actually improved as the SMO has progressed. And I think Dodik potentially could be Russia's secret weapon in terms of, supporting orthodoxy in these once Christian-dominated lands of the Balkans, as opposed to Alexander Vucic, who I think at this point we can just conclude as still holds the rank of the cock of Kosovo in an undisputed manner.
Unfortunately, that is the case. And unless you have anything else to say about EU situation or what's going on there, Dimitri, obviously we already discussed the countries recognizing Palestine, which is a big deal. Obviously, there are some countries with some minor elections, but it's not really election season much these days. So that was most of the EU news. Going to the United States, before we discuss church news, the only thing that's really going on is the Trump-Epstein hole does continue to be dug. People are beginning to move on. The media cycle is moving away. Trump has damaged his reputation, but he might, survive with some boomer support. But Ghislaine Maxwell has been moved to a low-security federal prison, supposedly that has no cameras outside of her cells, which, that's just amazing, right? But there's rumors that she's going to cut this deal with the feds. Some say that she's going to cut a deal with the Trump administration where she will sort of spill the beans on certain Democrats and their enemies for some kind of pardon or reduced sentence. I can't imagine even the stupidest of boomers falling for that and thinking Trump is somehow a good person for going along with something like that. But it does appear that she is, cooperating in some capacity and benefiting from it. So that's very, I don't want to say frightening. It's sort of all theatrical nonsense, but it's just disappointing to see that whatever semblance of, draining the swamp the Trump administration at once had, it's completely gone out the window. But feel free to bring anything else up before I move to church news, Dimitri. But I did want to bring up the first piece of church news that I came across this week. This is from Ortho Christian. Internal crisis erupts at St. Catherine's Monastery amid legal battle with Egypt. A dramatic internal conflict has erupted at the ancient St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai, where 15 monks have moved to depose their longtime abbot, His Eminence Archbishop Damianos, amid an ongoing legal crisis that threatens the monastery's very existence. For those who don't know, I don't know if this article explains it, maybe it does, but the Church of Sinai, as it's called, the St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai and its sort of connected constituencies on the Sinai Peninsula are sort of considered their own autonomous church as a monastery pretty much within the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. Some even say there's a case to be made that they are pseudo-autocephalous, and they have their abbot is also this archbishop, and they're able to do all sorts of things that, other jurisdictions may not be able to do. It's this very special situation. So that's sort of why things are happening this way. This crisis began with Egypt's Ismailia Court of Appeals ruling in May 2025 that has been interpreted as threatening the monastery's property rights, despite the monastery's 1,500-year presence at the site. In response to these Egyptian legal challenges, Greek authorities worked to establish legal protections for the monastery. The Greek parliament recently passed legislation granting legal status to the monastery and establishing a body to represent its interests in dealings with Egyptian authorities. Archbishop Damianos praised this move as long overdue, describing it as a moment when The Orthodox monastery of Sinai became a point of unity for Hellenism and Orthodoxy. However, this very legislation appears to have triggered an internal rebellion. On Wednesday, July 30th, 15 monks convened what they called a General Assembly and unanimously decided to remove Archbishop Damianos of Sinai, Pharon, and Rhythos from the position of abbot and archbishop of the Holy Basilica and autonomous monastery of the Holy and God-trodden Mount Sinai, according to Ramphea. Quite the title there. The decision was reportedly sent to the Patriarch of Jerusalem for ratification. Archbishop Damianos, who at 91 has served as abbot for over 5 decades, strongly condemned the monks' actions and rejected their authority to remove him. In a lengthy statement, he declared some fathers of the Holy Monastery of Sinai moved, deliberated, planned the betrayal with the purpose not to observe, but to conspire to violate the divine and sacred canons and the statutes of the Holy Monastery of Sinai. The archbishop characterized the monks' actions as an ecclesiastical coup and accused them of conducting unconstitutional activities that scandalized the faithful people of God, undermine the unity of the brotherhood, lead the monastery to Babylonian captivity, and above all, offer their best service to those who wish that the Golgotha of the holy monastery should not end. He particularly criticized the timing of their revolt, lamenting that just when hope had returned and efforts to resolve the monastery's legal crisis were beginning to bear fruit, internal discord had erupted to undermine progress. The archbishop noted that Egypt's foreign minister is scheduled to visit Athens on August 6th and had expressed hope that we rightfully expect the end of the Golgotha of the holy monastery. The archbishop insisted the monks failed to follow proper canonical procedures, noting that monastery regulations require a synod to be convened by 2/3 of the brotherhood and that he was invited to the assembly but did not attend. Following the monk's attempted removal, Archbishop Damianos sent a formal letter to his beatitude, Patriarch Theophilos of Jerusalem, who has jurisdiction over the monastery. In the letter, he expresses his deep sorrow and strong protest against the actions of specific monks, which he characterizes as uncanonical, seditious, and offensive against the monastery, its spiritual order, and canonical administration. The letter also raises questions about the procedure for convening the General Assembly and the legitimacy of the decisions attempted to be made. As abbot, Archbishop Damianos declared his intention to apply canonical sanctions against the rebellious monks, stating, "As their spiritual father, I have the duty to make every effort so that they understand their mistake and do not become patricides." He concluded with an appeal for unity. Let us all be inspired by the unity shown by the Greek Parliament from one end to the other these days for the salvation of the Holy Monastery of Sinai, the monastery which houses approximately 20 monks and sits at the foot of Mount Sinai where Moses received the Ten Commandments, now faces both external legal threats from Egyptian authorities and internal division among its own brotherhood over how to respond to the crisis. So, obviously, I don't support any kind of schism or ecclesiastical renegadery, but it says that monks can convene a assembly or synod of 2/3 of the members and vote to see this kind of thing. If there's only 20 monks at the monastery and 15 of them convened, that's well over 2/3. So again, I'm not saying the monks are right, or I don't know who's right here, but I think the Patriarch of Jerusalem is going to have to actually review the documents here and decide who is correct. But on the one hand, it seems good that the Greek Parliament and Hellenism, all these things are defending this. But on the other hand, I could see how the monks are saying, these are more, golden handcuffs tying us to, a state that also, supports gay marriage. So I think I could see both sides of the argument here. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Dimitri. If you have any other European news, feel free to let us know. But if not, we also want to hear about what's going on in Ukraine because the persecution of the church and the schismatic nonsense there continues.
Oh, no, absolutely. There's been, speaking of schismatics, these are the arch schismatics, I would say. And any Roman Catholic listeners, I think, pay attention to this because the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Kiev and Galicia in the West, that is, so he's the leader of the Ukrainian Roman Catholics, I would say, Sviatoslav Shevchuk, has come out in full support of Zelensky. Now, we know this particular fellow, this Archbishop Shevchuk, was in support of Zelensky a long time ago. Since his election, he supported Zelensky over Poroshenko. But his history is very interesting because he actually supported the Maidan coup in the first place. So interestingly, the Roman Catholic liberal community in Ukraine supported the overthrowing of the pro-Russian government all the way back then, more than a decade ago. And now, what kind of statement has he made this week? It's very bizarre, but we've heard of the recent protests, a lot of which the protests I think are I would say semi-artificial, because a lot of these young people who have been protesting against Zelensky because he's banned NABU and another organization which were investigating corruption, a lot of these young people never came out onto the streets to protest against the war or any other of the negative decisions that Zelensky has made. So I'm starting to think that there's almost an inside Ukraine war, Conrad, among influential NGO groups who are sort of pro-Soros, I guess maybe even pro-Poroshenko, who are lining up against Zelensky. There's maybe even they're more aligned with the UK, more aligned with some of the oppositionary groups, which will maybe run against Zelensky if there's a proper peace or ceasefire installed and there's a new presidential race in Ukraine. But Sviatoslav Shevchuk, this archbishop, he stated that none of these protesters are pious Christians. If they were, they wouldn't protest against the rightful rule of the president of Ukraine during a war. He said that all the protesters should go home. Nobody should be protesting against Zelensky. And I'm saying this in summary. He released a video address, which is about 40 seconds long. So the Archbishop of the Ukrainians, who are Roman Catholic, has openly stated that Zelensky is the rightful ruler of Ukraine. Nobody should protest against him for any reason, let alone corruption, which is very curious. And look, I'm not going to say anything sort of hyper negative about Roman Catholics, but this does show that perhaps the Vatican has a very different position on the Ukrainian issue than some of us may presume. You know, we've kind of assumed that the Roman Catholics would be in support of Metropolitan Onufriy, and they'd be against persecution, but I don't think that's actually the case if we look at the history of how the Roman Catholic high clergy have been behaving in Ukraine over the last decade. So that's very interesting. And at the same time, speaking about, ecumenism and all the other negative things coming out from that, Patriarch Bartholomew gives an address on the 29th of July at the World Council of Religions for Peace held in Istanbul. And it's very convoluted. It's a long read. I won't be citing all of it, but just reading this portion of what Patriarch Bartholomew said. He said, within this landscape of spiritual desolation, interreligious dialogue emerges not simply as a theological preoccupation or a luxury of peaceful times, but as an inexorable necessity, as an act of collective resistance. The encounter of the different religious traditions, each one a bearer of a unique experience of the sacred, becomes the necessary condition for the confrontation with a globalized meaninglessness. And the quote continues, he speaks about the need to form an ambitious intellectual edifice of a common sacred worldview amongst all religions, a common sacred flourishing, which will come out as a theoretical foundation. And I'll just stop there. This is the crux of Patriarch Bartholomew's speech in Istanbul. However, we note the fact that he does open up with a disclaimer that this is not an ecumenist statement, and then he continues on proclaiming essentially ecumenist talking points. I'm not sure what Patriarch Bartholomew is pointing towards. If he really wanted to be an avant-garde patriarch and bishop, he would most likely speak out against the genocide taking place in Gaza, against the persecution of the church happening in Ukraine, which unfortunately his synod fomented and assisted in. And at the moment, Patriarch Bartholomew is just coming out as somebody who is chasing PR, chasing these big peaceful proclamations, United Nations-esque statements, and promoting a light version of ecumenism still, even when, frankly, he's a very sick man. I believe he's sick with cancer at the moment. So it's just unfortunate that a hierarch of his stature, someone who knew saints personally, who was responsible for canonizing Saint Paisios, him and his synod, for canonizing so many of the Greek elders of recent years, and yet these sort of massive statements come out, which are incredibly convoluted. Christ is not mentioned at all, I believe, in this particular speech that he gave on the 29th of July. The church fathers aren't quoted. The scripture isn't cited. What's the point if you're a patriarch and the ecumenical leader of the Orthodox world to even give an address of this sort? Again, maybe I'm missing it. And sort of returning to Ukraine for a moment, going back to NABU, this organization which is supposed to root out corruption in Ukraine. Again, this was created during the interregnum period between Maidan and, of course, Zelensky coming to power, created by US NGOs. This particular organization apparently would only criticize, in this 2014/2019 period, it would only investigate Ukrainian politicians who are specifically anti-LGBTQ. So those Ukrainian politicians, right-wing ones, based ones who would come out and they would target the alphabet community in Ukraine. Artyom Dmitruk, a former member of the Ukrainian Verkhovnaya Rada, reveals in an interview that, in fact, NABU was trying to promote these liberal, degenerate values in Ukraine. And I'm not saying Zelensky was correct in targeting NABU. All I'm saying is it's a battle between demons. Like, you have NABU supported by, who knows, some sort of Sorosite NGO structure supporting degenerate values in Ukraine. And then you have Zelensky, a thief, a warmongering, essentially, not a heresiarch, but someone who supports schism, who supports persecution of the church. And these two structures, Zelensky's administration and these NGOs battling against one another in Ukraine, is simply a symptom of the spiritual, the downfall of the majority of the Ukrainian people, having fallen to sin over all these decades since 1991, and the disconnection, the dissolution of the USSR, and the fact that no spiritual framework was created over that time to even support flourishing of orthodoxy in this land. And I think now we're suffering from that. and not just us, but our relatives, anyone who's in Ukraine. And I think the entire world is being pushed into a third world war because of these failures. And sort of more positive news from Ukraine, Conrad, we have on the 28th of July, a huge celebration in memory of Saint Vladimir of Kiev, who baptized the Russian people in the Dnieper, in the ancient city, the ancient Greek city of Chersonesus outside of Sevastopol in Crimea, led by our favorite Metropolitan Tikhon Shevkunov. Tens of thousands of Orthodox Christians gathered at this new reconstructed Byzantine/ancient Greek city with these cool statues and Orthodox churches and chapels, essentially like a rebuilt, I don't want to say Orthodox Christian theme park, but it's almost like, it looks like what perhaps Constantinople would have looked like in its prime. It's a wonderful place, and he gave an amazing sermon about the importance of the Orthodox faith and how key it was that Saint Vladimir chose Orthodox Christianity, and he baptized the Russian people in the faith that he must have had at the time, of course, surrendering all his pagan traditions to embrace Christianity. And he had such fiery faith that he didn't need to convert, but he did. And he converted his whole people behind him and essentially forced the evangelization of the Russian people and promoted it with his entire heart. And this is why Saint Vladimir was canonized by the church, and he's very well respected. He's an example of essentially a new, equal to the apostles. He is like a new evangelist of the faith. So this really great sermon was supported by Patriarch Kirill, who gave a similar sermon in Moscow, and he emphasized the importance of Ukraine and Russia, how they're united by this common grounding and these common collection of saints who have shown forth from these Eastern Russian lands. And I think that's very key. And, the disconnection of Russia and Ukraine, and maybe political, geopolitical, but spiritually, the countries are, of course, united. And, the footage that was released this week, Conrad, once the Russians have taken Chasiv Yar, is quite harrowing. I did want to mention, we'll probably post this in our Telegram for all to see. So just search up Chasiv Yar Church, a church of Saints Boris and Gleb. This really shows you the mark that the war has left on a lot of the Donetsk People's Republic oblasts. You can kind of see the church of Saints Boris and Gleb in Chasiv Yar completely destroyed. I don't think I've ever seen a church in all of you throughout the entire duration of the SMO and the Ukrainian war to be in this particular state. And it's quite a large church. I believe it may even be a cathedral dedicated to these two ancient saints, and it's completely demolished. I'm not even sure who exactly caused the damage. It could have been both sides, the Russians and Ukrainians, essentially accidentally hitting it with artillery. Nevertheless, it's just an example, a symbol of the war, I guess, tearing apart the Orthodox landscape, which is why this entire thing is a huge tragedy and why we have to cover it in all detail so that none of these little niche anecdotal stories sort of escape us. So overall, Conrad, has been quite a positive week because we haven't seen any drastic beatings, persecutions of Orthodox bishops. Again, Metropolitan Arsenius remains in custody indefinitely in Dnipropetrovsk, the sort of capital, New Jerusalem, Khazarian capital of the Ukrainian shadow state. So again, there are Ukrainian clergy who are still imprisoned and they're not being released because, again, officially the state has commenced persecution. So we have to pray for those hierarchs who are still in custody.
Of course, and unfortunately, that's more people than one might think. And the Svyatogorsk monastery is still very much on the front lines. Their abbot, still struggling there, and struggling in prison. So it's very unfortunate that this ecclesiastical battle is going on as the physical battle on the battlefield, of course, unfolds too. But some good news. The Ukrainian court has ruled in favor of the church in Elets with a monastery dispute there. The Ukrainian Commercial Court has rejected a lawsuit by the ancient Chernigov National Architectural and Historical Preserve that sought to evict the canonical UOC from the historical Elets Monastery complex in Chernigov. Judge Andrei Sidorenko of the Chernigov Regional Commercial Court announced the decision on July 28th, ruling against the preserve's claim to force the Chernigov Diocese of the UOC to return property and cease using several buildings within the monastery complex. The ruling allows the church to continue its free use of the buildings. The dispute centers on the continued use of the ancient monastery by UOC representatives following the expiration of its free use agreement. The case has been ongoing since 2023. Holy Assumption Women's Monastery, they've been using those buildings. There are 45 nuns living there, some over 90 years old. And of course, the schismatics were trying to kick them out on a few days' notice and do all these sorts of things. So a light at the end of the tunnel there. Some judges, I think, are realizing the persecution is not helping the Ukrainian cause in any way. So that's good to see. Other unfortunate news here, though, from Poland. The schismatics encroach on Polish church territory again, violating their own tomos. This from Ortho-Christian. Hierarchs of the schismatic OCU encroached on the territory of the Polish Orthodox Church again this week On Sunday, July 27th, fake Metropolitan Hilarion, head of the OCU chaplaincy mission, and fake Archbishop Mitrofan and other OCU quote-unquote clergy served in Warsaw, reports the Union of Orthodox Journalists. During the service, a supposed deacon was pretended to be ordained. The schismatic served in Warsaw without the blessing of his Beatitude Metropolitan Sawa, primate of the Polish Orthodox Church, who, together with the whole of his local church, doesn't recognize the OCU or the ordinations of its clerics. OCU leadership has repeatedly complained about the fact that the Polish Church doesn't recognize its organization, but also encroaches upon Polish Church territory without a blessing. In January 2022, Alexander Drabinko, a formerly canonical bishop who apostatized to the OCU, served in Poland. The Polish hierarchs protested this uncanonical move to the Patriarch of Constantinople, which created and exercises oversight over the OCU. Moreover, with such moves, OCU hierarchs also violate the Tomos of autocephaly they received from Constantinople, which limits their territory to Ukraine, with no right to establish communities abroad. So these idiots are just doing whatever they want. They're just going, celebrating. I'm sure the Polish government supports them, so they're just doing it. So that's that with the schismatics. I don't know why they still think they're ever going to be successful. I think as the Russians advance, as the Russians eventually are going to establish the situation on the ground, I don't think the OCU has 10 years left in them. So I think that's a good prediction, I guess, but we'll see. Final church news story here. This is about Manathos. Dochariu Monastery explains their refusal to welcome the Greek prime minister to Manathos. There's been a lot of disputes. I remember the cell dwellers, as they were called, released a statement against sort of the 8 monasteries on Mount Athos that did welcome Kyriakos Mitsotakis to the Holy Mountain. All of these skeet and hut dwellers, claiming to represent 75-80% of the monks on Mount Athos, said they have nothing to do with his visit. They do not recognize him. They didn't welcome him. These sorts of things. So the Dochariu Monastery, which is one of the 20 Athonite monasteries, they issued a statement. The monastery statement, released in response to criticism from fellow Orthodox believers, reveals that several monasteries privately opposed the prime minister's visit, but chose not to publicly voice their objections. The monks at Dochariu, however, felt compelled to explain their position after many of our brothers felt bitterness, indignation, pain, and were scandalized by what took place during the recent visit. Our ecclesiastical conscience does not tolerate the welcoming with festive bell ringing the one who, through legislation, dissolved the foundations of Christian anthropology and family, the statement reads, referencing Greece's legalization of same-sex marriage and adoption. The monastery explained that it initially expressed our disagreement and ultimately refused to take part in the ecclesiastical and overall reception of the prime minister. The monks emphasized they do not oppose the institutional sovereignty of the Greek state over the self-governing Athonite peninsula, but could not in good conscience participate in ceremonial aspects of the visit. The statement particularly criticizes the prime minister for permitting what they called the desecration of the divine person of Christ, the Panagia, and his saints through artworks displayed at the National Gallery, and for practically nullifying evangelical truths with various unacceptable decisions. Dochariu's public stance appears to support claims made earlier by cell-dwelling monks who stated that approximately 1,400 of Mount Athos' 2,100 monks opposed the prime minister's reception. Those monks had contradicted the official statement from the sacred community, which represents the 20 ruling monasteries, and had defended the decision to receive Mitsotakis. The Dochariu statement reveals the monastery also declined to participate in the announced $100 million funding program, or €100 million funding program for Mount Athos infrastructure, saying they wanted to cut off the opportunity of those who want an opportunity and avoid causing scandal to even one simple soul. So, Blessed Fathers, turning away the rewards of the world. The monks concluded by affirming their commitment to remain on the Holy Mountain regardless of criticism. We will stay here. We will celebrate the Divine Liturgy daily. We will cultivate with our own hands from dawn to dusk the gardens of the Holy Mountain. We will care for the flowers that grow on the rocks and cliffs so they will not be crushed by profane hands. The statement provides insight into the internal deliberations surrounding the visit, where monastic tradition typically favors silence over public confrontation. The monastery acknowledged this preference, noting that the angelic way of life and our monastic identity dictate that we do not make noise but mourn, that we do not self-promote but pray in silence. So if anyone wants to read the full statement, it's on orthochristian.com. Easy to find on the front page right now. So very encouraging to see a strong stance from one of the 20 monasteries. Canonical monastery, of course, very, very holy monks there. Very beautiful monastery. They've got some incredible statues of the archangels on some pillars there. It's quite a sight. So keep Mount Athos in your prayers. Pray for the monks there. Pray for an end to all schisms. But that's the last church news I have. Dimitri, any final pieces of news from you or just your final parting words for the audience today?
No, I just want to thank all our great listeners and supporters. We've had some amazing AFA hours, some huge successful hits, interviews. We have even better ones. And I would say, it's ever improving. We have some great AFA hours coming out for you in August. So stay tuned. We will have a Q&A coming up as well sometime very soon. So be on the lookout, because if we receive, say, more than 30 questions, we may need to begin selecting certain ones. And again, certain questions will simply remain unanswered. So keep an eye out on the email, keep an eye out on the thread appearing on Substack, because we do want some of your best questions to answer sometime this month in August. So thank you very much for all your support.
No, thanks for making it here to the end of the episode. Please like the episode. I should have said it at the beginning, but if you're hearing this now, like on Substack. We want to be getting well over 50, 60 likes. We really should be on these Substack episodes. I know a lot of people just listen in their email browser or whatever, but please download the Substack app, like the episodes. It really helps us out. worldwarnow.co. That is how you can get behind the paywall, listen to all of our exclusive Ether Hour content. You get access to the 4.5 hour translated into English for the very first time, Death of Empire documentary about the fall and collapse of the Russian Empire and the rise of the satanic Soviet regime. You get access to the full ritual regicide articles from Dmitry explaining the ritual regicide of the Romanov royal martyrs. And of course, hundreds and hundreds of hours of Ether Hour content dating back multiple years at this point. So really, really check that out. Fantastic value at worldwarnow.co. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel at World War Now. This week with the live stream, I should be live on YouTube, on X, and here on Substack. So stay tuned for that. Should be the inaugural Substack World War live streams. So all of those things are coming. Be sure to follow me on X at GnomeRad. Follow Dmitry at WWN Host. Follow the World War Now X at World War Now _. Really good stuff coming on there. Follow us on Telegram at World War Now Telly. I'm trying to think of where else I could be missing, but those are all the places. Again, worldwarnow.co. That is the home base. Like the episodes wherever you happen to be listening to them. And I will leave us with a final quote here. St. Paisios of Mount Athos. He says, "Yes, there will be war, and Turkey will be struck from the north. It will suffer enormous destruction, but not a single Greek will be harmed. As for Constantinople, will be administered by Russians, Greeks, and Europeans. This storm will reach as far as Israel, and then the Jews will realize their mistakes." So that's sort of the direction, obviously, we point to when it comes to these sorts of things. And I want to thank everybody once again for listening. Keep us in your prayers. Keep the church in your prayers, those persecuted and those dealing with the consequences and the results of forced schisms. So again, thank you all so much for tuning in. worldwarnow.co. Check it out, and we will see you on the next one. God bless.